Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight we're easing into a story that at first glance appears to belong entirely to the modern world. A recent event wrapped in satellite imagery, weather alerts and scrolling headlines. Yet one that quietly invites much older ways of thinking to linger beneath its surface. We're not beginning with gods descending from the sky or ancient names carved into stone, but with a winter storm, a name spoken briefly on the news, a disruption that arrived, passed and was quickly folded into memory as just another seasonal event. Winter Storm Fern was described in technical language, tracked in models, measured in temperatures and pressure systems, explained with charts and maps that seem to account for every detail. And yet, when something arrives with such reach, such timing, and such consequence, it naturally invites another layer of attention, one that is not satisfied by data alone. Tonight's exploration does not rush toward conclusions. It does not insist that something extraordinary must have happened, nor does it dismiss the idea outright. Instead, it does what ancient texts so often do when they speak of events that disrupt the ordinary rhythm of life. It slows down. It looks carefully at what was seen, what was recorded, and what quietly disappeared once attention moved elsewhere. The question of whether Winter Storm Fern could have served as a cover for Anunnaki activity is not treated here as an assertion, but as a framework, a lens through which to examine how disruption, distraction, and silence have always accompanied moments of transition in the stories humanity tells about its world. In the modern age, weather is presented as one of the few remaining forces that still commands universal respect. Storms do not negotiate. They do not announce intentions beyond probability cones and warning systems. They arrive according to physics, we are told, and depart when conditions change. Winter Storm. Fern fit neatly into this understanding. It emerged within expected seasonal parameters, intensified rapidly, and spread across regions already accustomed to winter volatility. Power grids strained, transportation slowed, and attention narrowed. People focused on staying warm, staying safe, and staying informed. The collective gaze turned downward and inward, away from the horizon and toward immediate survival and routine disruption. This narrowing of attention is not a modern phenomenon. Ancient records describe similar moments not in the language of meteorology, but in the language available to them. Floods, tempests, unnatural cold, days without light. These were not merely environmental events. They were moments when ordinary human activity paused, when temples closed, markets fell silent, and travel ceased. In those pauses, the texts suggest, other movements became possible. Not dramatic invasions or open displays of power, but quiet adjustments, relocations, observations carried out while humanity was preoccupied with endurance. Winter Storm Fern, viewed through this older pattern, becomes less about snow accumulation and wind speed and more about timing. It arrived at a moment when global systems were already under strain. Supply chains were fragile, energy infrastructure was operating near limits. Digital dependence had reached a point where even minor disruptions produced cascading effects. A storm in such a context is more than inconvenience. It creates gaps, it creates blind spots, it creates plausible explanations for anomalies that might otherwise draw sustained scrutiny. The idea of the Anunnaki, as preserved in the earlier Sumerian texts, is often misunderstood as one of dramatic arrival and overt intervention. Yet the tablets themselves rarely describe such events in explicit terms. Instead, they speak of presence layered into order, of beings who operate within systems rather than shattering them. They appear after structures are already in place, after heaven and earth have been separated, after cycles of time have been established. Their actions are administrative, judicial, corrective. They do not announce themselves with spectacle. They function within the existing framework of reality. In this light, a winter storm is not an obstacle to activity. It is an opportunity for it. Noise from the human world diminishes. Surveillance focuses on weather impacts. Emergency responses dominate communication channels. Unusual movements can be attributed to relief efforts, infrastructure repair, or weather-related anomalies. When sensors fail or data becomes inconsistent, the explanation is already prepared. The storm did it. The cold interfered. The system froze. Attention moves on. This pattern is echoed repeatedly in ancient narratives, though expressed in symbolic language rather than analytical terms. When the gods act, it is often during times of chaos or transition. Floods precede resets. Darkness accompanies judgment. Storms mark boundaries between eras. These are not portrayed as punishments alone, but as conditions under which change becomes possible without resistance. Humanity is occupied with survival. The divine realm adjusts the balance quietly. Winter Storm Fern did not last long in public consciousness. Its name faded quickly, replaced by the next event, the next alert, the next concern. This rapid forgetting is itself significant. In Sumerian thought, what mattered was not the dramatic moment, but what followed it. The storm passes, the flood recedes, the world resumes, altered in subtle ways that are difficult to trace back to a single cause. Records become fragmented. Memory becomes selective. In modern terms, this selectivity is reinforced by the sheer volume of information. Data overwhelms interpretation. Each disruption competes with countless others for attention. Patterns become difficult to see because they are distributed across time, space, and systems. A single storm does not stand out. It blends into a larger narrative of instability and climate volatility. Within that blending, the possibility of deliberate activity becomes indistinguishable from chance. The Anunnaki, as described in the oldest texts, are not invaders exploiting chaos, but overseers maintaining balance. If they were to operate within the modern world, the logic of their mythological role would not require visible intervention. It would require conditions that allow observation, adjustment, and withdrawal without detection. A winter storm provides such conditions naturally. It disrupts without suspicion. It conceals without effort. It resolves itself without leaving clear traces. This does not mean that Winter Storm Fern was engineered or controlled. The ancient text rarely suggests such direct manipulation of natural forces. Instead, they imply alignment. The gods act when conditions permit. They do not create chaos so much as move within it. The storm, in this sense, would not be the cause of activity, but its cover. A coincidence not in the sense of randomness, but in the sense of convergence. Modern society tends to separate the natural from the intentional. Weather belongs to one category, agency belongs to another. Ancient thought did not draw such rigid lines. Natural events were expressions of larger systems in which intention, order, and disruption were intertwined. To ask whether a storm could serve as cover is not to claim that it was unnatural, but to suggest that natural events have always provided the backdrop against which other forms of activity become possible. As we settle into this exploration, the aim is not to convince or to debunk, but to trace a pattern that spans millennia. A pattern in which moments of environmental upheaval coincide with shifts that are noticed only later, if at all. A pattern in which attention is the most valuable resource and distraction the most effective veil. Winter Storm Fern becomes one instance in a long lineage of events that briefly rearrange the world's focus, creating space for something else to occur quietly. What follows will move carefully through this idea, not by accumulating dramatic claims, but by examining how ancient descriptions of presence, movement, and silence might intersect with modern experiences of disruption. The story does not hinge on proof, but on coherence, on whether the pattern holds when placed alongside what we know about both ancient myth and contemporary systems. As the storm fades from memory, the conditions it created remain worth examining. not as an ending, but as a beginning of a slower, deeper line of thought that continues forward. Sudden global disruptions have always drawn human attention toward myth, not because people were incapable of understanding the physical world, but because disruption exposes limits. When the ordinary structure of life breaks down quickly and across wide areas, explanations based solely on routine experience no longer feel sufficient. This is true whether the disruption comes from flood, fire, cold, darkness, or silence. The moment daily patterns collapse, the human mind shifts from prediction to interpretation. It looks for meaning, hierarchy, and intention, not as a comfort mechanism, but as a way to restore coherence when systems fail. In the ancient world, stability was rare and fragile. Agricultural cycles depended on narrow environmental margins. Cities rose in floodplains, deserts, and coastal zones, precisely because those regions offered fertility, trade routes, or strategic value. But they also carried constant risk. When a disruption occurred, it was rarely local in effect. A failed flood season could ripple through food supply, political authority, religious practice, and social order. A single event could destabilize an entire region. In such conditions, myth was not an escape from reality. It was a framework for understanding how reality behaved when it no longer followed expectations. Sumerian, Akkadian, Egyptian, and later Mediterranean texts repeatedly describe moments when the world behaves differently, not gradually, but suddenly. The language used is consistent across cultures that never directly interacted. Waters rise without warning. The sun withdraws. Cold appears where it does not belong. Winds arrive with force beyond seasonal norms. These descriptions are not exaggerated weather reports. They are signals within the narrative that the usual order has been suspended. When that suspension occurs, myth enters not as decoration, but as explanation. Myth functions differently during stable times and disruptive times. During stability, it reinforces order. It explains why kings rule, why temples stand, why rituals must be maintained. During disruption, myth explains why order has been interrupted and who still retains authority when human systems fail. This distinction matters. The appearance of myth during disruption is not random. It is structural. It fills the explanatory vacuum created when practical knowledge can no longer predict outcomes. Modern perspectives often frame myth as a primitive attempt to explain natural phenomena. This interpretation fails to account for the sophistication of ancient mythological systems. These were not simple cause and effect stories. They were layered models of authority, responsibility, and constraint. When a flood occurred, the question was not merely why the water rose, it was why the system that normally prevented such devastation had allowed it. Myth answered this by shifting focus from mechanics to governance. In many traditions, sudden disruption is associated with oversight rather than failure. The gods do not lose control, they intervene, withdraw, or reassert boundaries. Even destructive events are framed as corrective rather than accidental. This framing is important because it preserves the idea that the world remains ordered, even when it appears chaotic. Without this assurance, societies fracture quickly. Myth stabilizes belief when material stability disappears. Global disruption amplifies this effect. A localized event can be dismissed as misfortune. A widespread event demands a broader explanation. Ancient texts consistently mark the scale of disruption as a key indicator of significance. When multiple cities are affected, when trade routes collapse simultaneously, when agricultural failure spans regions, the language shifts from human error to cosmic imbalance. The scope of impact determines the explanatory level. This pattern continues into later historical periods. Medieval chronicles describe plagues not only as disease, but as signs of moral or spiritual imbalance. Early modern accounts of extreme winters and failed harvests often include references to divine displeasure or hidden forces at work. Even as scientific understanding developed, the instinct to interpret sudden, widespread disruption as meaningful did not disappear. It adapted. The modern world retains this instinct, though it expresses it differently. When systems fail rapidly, people search for hidden causes, coordinated actions, or suppressed information. Conspiracy thinking is often treated as a modern pathology, but it occupies the same cognitive space that myth once held. It attempts to impose agency on events that feel too large, too sudden, or too consequential to be random. The language changes, the function remains. Winter storms, in particular, occupy a unique position in this pattern. Cold disrupts infrastructure in ways heat often does not. Power systems fail. Transportation halts. Communication becomes unreliable. Unlike storms that arrive with dramatic visual cues, winter events unfold quietly. Snow accumulates. Ice forms. Systems degrade gradually until they fail suddenly. This creates a sense of delayed causality, where the visible trigger appears insufficient to explain the scale of impact. Ancient cultures were acutely aware of cold as a destabilizing force. Even in regions not typically associated with severe winters, sudden drops in temperature were recorded as ominous. Cold was associated with absence of growth, absence of sound, absence of movement. In mythic language, cold often signals withdrawal rather than attack. The gods do not strike, they step back. Life falters in the space they leave behind. This withdrawal is critical to understanding why disruption attracts myth. Myth does not always explain presence. Often, it explains absence. Why did the rains stop? Why did the sun hide? Why did warmth leave the land? These questions are not about mechanisms, they're about authority. Who controls continuity, and why was it interrupted? The Anunnaki, within Sumerian cosmology, are not creators of chaos. They are administrators of fate. Their association with the underworld and judgment places them at points of transition rather than origin. They appear when outcomes are determined, not when systems are built. In this sense, their mythological role aligns closely with moments of disruption rather than moments of stability. Disruption forces re-evaluation of boundaries. What was once considered fixed becomes negotiable. Social hierarchies strain. Political authority is tested. Religious practices intensify or fracture. Myth thrives in this environment because it addresses questions that practical responses cannot. How long will this last? What has changed? What remains intact? These questions are existential rather than logistical. In ancient texts, disruptions are often followed by reorganization. After floods, kingship is re-established. After darkness, light returns with altered rules. After cold or famine, new rituals appear. Myth records these transitions, preserving memory of the old order while legitimizing the new. Without myth, disruption would appear meaningless. With myth, it becomes purposeful, even if destructive. The attraction of myth during disruption is also tied to attention. When life is stable, attention disperses across many activities. During crisis, attention narrows. Communities focus collectively on survival. This collective focus amplifies shared narratives. Stories spread quickly, interpretations synchronize. Myth gains traction because it is shared, not because it is imposed. Modern disruptions follow the same pattern, though mediated by technology. News cycles compress time. Social media accelerates narrative formation. A sudden global event produces immediate interpretation alongside information. Speculation spreads not because people reject data, but because data alone does not address the full experience of disruption. Numbers do not explain unease. Models do not restore trust. This is where older mythological structures re-emerge, often unconsciously. People speak of resets, awakenings, hidden actors, and cycles. These are not scientific concepts, but they persist because they map onto human experience of disruption more effectively than technical language alone. They restore a sense of pattern when continuity breaks. Sudden global disruptions also erase normal accountability. When failure is widespread, responsibility becomes diffuse. No single actor can be blamed easily. This diffusion creates space for mythic attribution. Agency shifts upward or outward. Forces beyond ordinary human control are invoked, whether framed as divine, extraterrestrial, systemic, or conspiratorial. Ancient societies institutionalize this process through ritual and narrative. Modern societies experience it chaotically, without shared frameworks to contain it. As a result, myth appears fragmented rather than unified. Competing explanations circulate simultaneously. The underlying impulse, however, remains consistent: to locate meaning in disruption. The persistence of myth during sudden disruption is not evidence of irrationality. It is evidence of pattern recognition under stress. Humans are not satisfied with knowing how something happened. They want to know what it means for the structure of their world. When the answer is unclear, myth fills the gap. In examining events like Winter Storm Fern through this lens, the question is not whether myth replaces science, but how it operates alongside it. Scientific explanations describe processes. Myth describes significance. When disruption occurs at scale, significance becomes the dominant concern. People want to know whether the event was isolated or indicative, accidental or symptomatic. Ancient texts preserve this distinction carefully. They recorded floods and storms not merely as disasters, but as markers. Something before them differed from something after. Myth encoded these shifts so they could be recognized later. Without myth, memory dissolves into unrelated events. As attention returns to normal after disruption, myth does not disappear. It recedes. It remains available for future reference, ready to resurface when the next rupture occurs. This continuity across time explains why similar narratives appear repeatedly across cultures and eras. The triggers differ, the structure remains. The attraction of myth during sudden global disruption is therefore not mysterious. It is functional. It allows societies to integrate experiences that exceed ordinary explanation without abandoning coherence entirely. Whether framed through gods, cycles, hidden observers, or unseen administrators, myth provides a way to hold disruption within a larger order. This pattern sets the stage for examining specific events not as isolated anomalies but as moments where attention, interpretation and narrative align. Winter Storm Fern, like many disruptions before it, exists within this long tradition. It is not unique in attracting speculation. It is typical. And it is within that typicality that its deeper significance, whatever it may be, begins to take shape as the story continues forward without closing itself off. Winter Storm Fern entered public awareness as one more named system in a long sequence of seasonal disturbances, yet when examined closely, it occupies a slightly different position than most storms that pass through the modern record. Not because it shattered historical extremes or introduced unprecedented meteorological mechanics, but because of how it interacted with attention, infrastructure, and timing. Ordinary storms are measured by accumulation totals, wind speeds, or duration. This one was defined more by the conditions it created than by the statistics it produced. The first distinction lies in how quickly Fern transitioned from forecast to disruption. Most winter systems follow a familiar rhythm. Models signal their arrival days in advance. Preparations occur, adjustments are made. The event unfolds roughly as expected, even if intensity varies. Fern compressed this cycle. Forecast confidence lagged behind development. Systems intensified faster than projected. By the time certainty arrived, response windows had already narrowed. This compression matters because it reduces the margin between awareness and impact, leaving less time for coordinated oversight and more reliance on automated systems that are themselves sensitive to cold. Cold affects technology differently than heat or precipitation alone. Electronics fail silently. Sensors degrade gradually. Mechanical components lose tolerance. Batteries drain faster. These effects are not dramatic, but they are cumulative. During Fern, multiple systems reported partial outages, degraded accuracy, or temporary blindness that were later attributed to temperature stress. Each instance was individually explainable. Taken together, they created a patchwork of reduced visibility across physical and digital infrastructure. Another difference lies in geographic distribution. Fern did not concentrate its effects in a single, clearly bounded region. Its reach was broad but uneven. Areas accustomed to winter strain experienced familiar disruptions, while regions less prepared encountered failures disproportionate to snowfall totals. This unevenness complicated response narratives. There was no single epicenter to focus on, no obvious threshold where the storm clearly exceeded historical norms. Instead, Fern revealed variability in resilience rather than raw power. This variability redirected attention inward. Communities focused on local conditions rather than the system as a whole. News coverage fragmented accordingly. Stories emphasized individual hardships, isolated outages, and localized responses. The storm ceased to be a singular event and became a collection of separate incidents. This fragmentation reduced the likelihood of sustained, unified analysis. Ordinary storms invite comparison. Fern dissolved into anecdotes. Timing amplified this effect. Fern arrived amid already elevated systemic strain. Energy networks were balancing increased demand. Transportation systems were recovering from prior disruptions. Supply chains were operating with limited redundancy. In such conditions, even modest environmental stress can cascade. Failures propagate laterally rather than vertically. One outage triggers another, not because the storm intensifies, but because the system has no slack. Ordinary storms test capacity. Fern exposed fragility. The distinction is subtle but important. Capacity implies a known limit. Fragility implies hidden thresholds that are only discovered when crossed. Fern crossed several such thresholds quietly. Systems did not fail spectacularly. They degraded just enough to reduce oversight and slow correction. The result was a landscape of partial functionality that appeared normal until examined closely. Public response reflected this ambiguity. There was concern but not alarm, disruption but not panic. Fern did not dominate attention long enough to become symbolic. It lacked the singular images that anchor memory. No defining moment, no iconic collapse. Without these markers, the storm slipped quickly into the background of seasonal volatility. This rapid normalization is itself unusual. Events that truly disrupt tend to linger. Fern passed without demanding interpretation. Another distinguishing feature was how Fern interacted with data. Meteorological records captured expected variables, but secondary data streams showed anomalies that were later smoothed over or attributed to noise. Temporary gaps appeared in sensor coverage. Certain datasets showed inconsistencies that were corrected in post-processing. These are routine practices. Data is rarely perfect in adverse conditions. What stands out is the density of these adjustments within a short window. In isolation, none of this suggests anything beyond operational complexity. Together, it suggests a moment where visibility was reduced across multiple layers simultaneously. Physical observation, digital monitoring, logistical tracking, and human attention all experience temporary narrowing. Ordinary storms may impact one or two of these layers. Fern touched all of them lightly but at the same time. The name itself faded quickly. Named storms often carry reputational weight. They become reference points. Fern did not. It was mentioned, addressed, and replaced in discourse within days. This brevity matters. Memory requires reinforcement. Without sustained narrative, events dissolve into the background noise of modern life. Fern's disappearance from collective attention occurred faster than its resolution would suggest. Ancient texts often describe significant events not by their magnitude, but by their aftermath. What changed afterward? What failed quietly? What no longer functioned the same way? Applying that lens here, Fern's significance lies less in immediate damage and more in subtle shifts that followed. Minor policy adjustments, quiet infrastructure reviews, unpublicized recalibrations. These responses did not announce crisis, they acknowledged strain. The storm also coincided with periods of reduced observational redundancy. Certain monitoring systems were offline for maintenance, others were operating in degraded modes due to cost-saving measures implemented earlier. These overlaps are not conspiratorial, they are logistical realities of complex systems, yet they contribute to moments where oversight is thinner than usual. Ordinary storms encounter full visibility. Fern encountered partial coverage. Human behaviour during Fern further distinguishes it. Cold drives people indoors. Movement slows. Outdoor activity declines sharply. Unlike heat waves or storms that prompt evacuation or emergency congregation, winter events isolate. This isolation reduces incidental observation. Fewer witnesses, fewer anomalies noticed simply because fewer people are present to notice them. Activity outside routine channels becomes easier to overlook. In ancient narratives, moments of cold and darkness are often associated with withdrawal rather than confrontation. The world becomes quieter. Boundaries blur. Movement occurs not in spectacle but in absence. Fern created a modern analogue to this condition, not through severity, but through distribution, a soft blanket of disruption rather than a sharp blow. Infrastructure repair during Fern also followed a different rhythm. Crews operated under constrained conditions, often prioritising restoration over investigation. Temporary fixes were favoured, diagnostics were deferred. This is standard practice during emergencies. Restore first, analyse later. The consequence is a lag between event and understanding. By the time analysis occurs, the context has vanished. Fern's interaction with communication systems reinforced this lag. Information flowed, but unevenly. Updates were frequent but narrow. Each organisation spoke within its domain. There was little synthesis. Without synthesis, patterns remain hidden. Ordinary storms often prompt centralised briefings and comprehensive summaries. Fern generated a series of localised reports that never fully converged. Another difference lies in expectation. Winter storms are expected to disrupt. This expectation lowers scrutiny. Anomalies are absorbed into the anticipated narrative of inconvenience. When something goes wrong during a storm becomes the explanation. This cognitive shortcut is efficient. It also masks secondary causes. Fern benefited from this effect more than most, because its impact aligned closely with what people already believed winter storms do. The duration of Fern's most disruptive phase was relatively short. Short enough to strain systems, but not long enough to exhaust them completely. This middle ground is important. Prolonged events leave clear records. Brief events leave clear boundaries. Intermediate events blur. Fern existed in that blur. Long enough to create gaps, short enough to close them quickly. In the context of Anunnaki narratives, such conditions are repeatedly described as windows rather than events. The texts do not dwell on storms themselves. They dwell on what occurs while attention is elsewhere. The storm is background. The activity is foreground, but only in hindsight. If no record preserves it, it remains invisible. Modern society lacks a unified mythological framework to encode such moments. Instead, it relies on data and archives that prioritize resolution over ambiguity. Once systems return to baseline, the incentive to revisit disruption diminishes. Fern's quiet resolution ensured it would not be re-examined deeply. This does not make Fern unique in isolation. Many storms share some of these traits. What distinguishes Fern is the convergence of multiple subtle factors at once: rapid intensification, fragmented impact, reduced visibility, pre-existing strain, accelerated forgetting. Each factor alone is unremarkable. Together they create a profile that differs from ordinary storms without announcing itself as exceptional. The difference, then, is not one of scale, but of context. Fern did not stand out because it was stronger, colder, or longer lasting than others. It stood out because it created conditions where oversight thinned without triggering alarm. It disrupted without dramatizing. It passed without insisting on remembrance. In ancient records, such moments are rarely highlighted directly. They are inferred from what follows: a gap in continuity, a shift in administration, a quiet reordering. Whether or not one accepts the idea of Anunnaki activity, the structural pattern remains recognizable. Events that attract myth are not always the loudest. Often, they are the ones that move through systems gently enough to avoid resistance. As attention returned to normal after Fern, the world appeared unchanged. Yet systems rarely return to exactly the same state. Minor adjustments accumulate. Thresholds are recalibrated. What was once marginal becomes acceptable. These incremental changes rarely carry names. They carry forward silently, shaping the conditions under which future disruptions will occur. This continuity is where Fern's distinction lingers, not as a singular anomaly, but as part of a pattern of events that briefly narrow attention, reduce visibility, and then dissolve into routine. In such moments, the difference between ordinary and significant is not measured by immediate impact, but by what the event allows to pass unnoticed as the story continues forward without closing itself. Silence is rarely treated as data, yet in moments of disruption it often carries as much information as anything that is recorded. When systems fail, when measurements pause, when explanations arrive already finalized, silence becomes a boundary marker. It tells us not what happened, but where observation stopped. During Winter Storm Fern, this silence appeared not as a dramatic absence, but as a series of small, ordinary gaps that were individually reasonable and collectively revealing. Modern societies rely on continuous streams of data to maintain the illusion of constant awareness. Sensors measure temperature, pressure, movement, energy flow, and communication traffic. Satellites observe weather systems, infrastructure, and land use. Logs are generated automatically, archived automatically, and interpreted automatically. Under normal conditions, this creates redundancy. When one system falters, another compensates. During Fern, several layers faltered at once, not catastrophically, but enough to thin the overall picture. Cold is uniquely effective at producing this thinning. Unlike sudden mechanical failure, cold degrades gradually. A sensor does not shut off, it drifts. A camera does not go dark, it loses clarity. A signal does not disappear, it weakens. These degradations often fall within acceptable tolerance ranges. They are flagged, corrected, or filtered out in post-processing. The result is a dataset that appears clean but has already been curated. Data gaps during Fern were explained in familiar language. Equipment malfunctioned due to low temperatures, temporary communication outages, power interruptions affecting telemetry. Each explanation was accurate within its scope. What they did not address was simultaneity. Multiple independent systems experience reduced fidelity at overlapping times. This overlap matters because it limits cross-verification. When redundancy fails quietly, confidence remains high, even as certainty decreases. Official explanations tend to prioritize resolution over completeness. Their purpose is not to explore every anomaly, but to restore function and public reassurance. This is not deception, it is structural necessity. During emergencies, clarity is valued over nuance. Messages are simplified, causes are summarized, ambiguity is minimized. In this process, silence is produced intentionally, not to hide information, but to prevent confusion. Fern generated this kind of silence efficiently. Press briefings focused on expected impacts. Restoration timelines were emphasized. Technical details were condensed. Once conditions improved, attention shifted rapidly. Follow-up investigations, if they occurred, remained internal. Reports were filed, adjustments made, and lessons integrated quietly into future planning documents. The public-facing narrative concluded early. This pattern mirrors ancient accounts of disruption remarkably closely. In Sumerian and later Mesopotamian texts, moments of upheaval are often followed by long periods of narrative quiet. The event is described briefly, its aftermath is compressed. What happens in between is left unspoken. Scholars have often attributed this to lost tablets or incomplete transmission. Yet the consistency of this pattern suggests intentional omission rather than accidental loss. Ancient scribes recorded what mattered for continuity of order. Details that did not serve that purpose were excluded. Silence preserved authority. Excess detail invited reinterpretation. By limiting what was recorded, the texts maintained coherence, even as reality shifted beneath them. Modern institutions operate under similar pressures, though framed in administrative rather than theological terms. Data gaps also emerge from prioritization. During Fern, resources were directed toward maintaining critical services. Monitoring non-essential systems was deprioritized. Maintenance logs were simplified. Diagnostic routines were postponed. These decisions were rational. They also reduced the granularity of the record. Once systems returned to normal, the incentive to reconstruct fine detail diminished sharply. Official explanations rely on models. Models simplify reality to make it manageable. They assume certain variables and ignore others. During Fern, models explained the storm effectively within known parameters. They accounted for temperature gradients, pressure systems, and atmospheric dynamics. What they did not attempt to explain were secondary effects that fell outside their scope. Anomalies not directly related to weather mechanics were categorized as noise. Noise is where silence accumulates. When data does not fit a model, it is often filtered out rather than explored, especially under time constraints. This is not malpractice. It is how large systems function. Yet it means that some information never enters the explanatory chain. It exists briefly, then disappears. The limits of official explanations are therefore not defined by dishonesty, but by mandate. Institutions are designed to answer specific questions. What caused the storm? How severe was it? When will conditions improve? They are not designed to ask whether the storm created conditions that enabled unrelated activity. That question falls outside their jurisdiction. This jurisdictional boundary is crucial. When something occurs that spans multiple domains, no single authority claims responsibility for explaining it fully. Weather agencies explain weather, energy regulators explain outages, transportation departments explain delays. Each narrative is complete within its domain. The intersection between them remains unaddressed. During Fern, these intersections multiplied. Power outages affected communication. Communication disruptions affected coordination. Coordination gaps affected response efficiency. Each link was acknowledged. The chain itself was not examined publicly. Silence filled the spaces between explanations. In ancient cosmologies, such spaces were attributed to intermediary realms. The air between heaven and earth, the waters beneath the land, the underworld beneath both. These realms were not chaotic. They were simply less visible. They housed activity that did not announce itself to the surface world. Modern systems lack mythological language for such spaces, but they still exist functionally. Data gaps also emerge from trust. When systems are trusted, their outputs are rarely questioned unless they fail visibly. During Fern, most systems appeared to function adequately. Minor discrepancies were corrected automatically. Trust remained intact. This trust reduced the impulse to investigate anomalies deeply. Silence persisted not because of secrecy, but because of confidence. Official explanations also operate within political constraints. Acknowledging uncertainty can undermine credibility. During disruption, maintaining authority is as important as conveying information. Clear narratives preserve order. Ambiguous narratives invite speculation. Institutions therefore close narratives quickly once immediate risk passes. This closure creates temporal silence. Events are declared finished. Attention moves on. Any remaining questions are reframed as future improvements rather than past uncertainties. Fern was closed efficiently. Its story ended while its effects were still unfolding quietly. The absence of sustained inquiry does not imply that nothing unusual occurred. It implies that whatever occurred did not exceed thresholds that demand institutional response. Many significant shifts occur below such thresholds. They alter systems incrementally rather than dramatically. These shifts rarely receive names. Ancient texts preserve this dynamic through omission. They record the flood, not the years of adjustment that followed. They describe the separation of heaven and earth, not the negotiations that stabilized the new order. Silence marks the space where change occurred without spectacle. Modern data practices replicate this pattern unintentionally. High-resolution data exists briefly, then is compressed, summarized, or discarded. Storage limits, cost considerations, and relevance filters shape what remains accessible. Over time, the detailed record thins. What survives is what was deemed important at the moment of archiving. Winter Storm Fern left behind such a thinned record, enough to explain disruption, not enough to reconstruct every interaction. This incompleteness is normal. It becomes significant only when examined as part of a larger pattern. The idea that silence can function as cover does not require intent. It requires only alignment. A storm creates distraction. Distraction reduces scrutiny. Reduced scrutiny allows activity, whether human, systemic, or otherwise, to proceed unnoticed. This alignment has occurred countless times throughout history. Official explanations, by design, restore normalcy. They do not dwell on what could not be observed. Once normalcy returns, silence is interpreted as closure. In mythological terms, this is the moment when gods withdraw and humans resume their routines, unaware of what has shifted. The limits of official explanations are therefore not failures but edges. Beyond those edges lie questions that institutions are not structured to ask. Ancient myth stepped into that space. Modern speculation does the same, though without shared structure. As Fern receded from attention, its data gaps became less visible. Silence hardened into absence. What was not recorded could no longer be examined. What was not examined ceased to matter. This is how events pass fully into the past, not because they were understood, but because they were absorbed. The presence of silence does not prove hidden activity. It establishes possibility. It marks the boundary where certainty ends. In that boundary, older patterns of interpretation reassert themselves, not as claims, but as frameworks waiting to be applied. What follows builds on this boundary, not by filling silence with conclusions, but by tracing how silence itself has always accompanied moments when attention shifted and systems adjusted quietly, carrying the story forward without resolution, without finality, and without requiring belief, only continued observation as the narrative moves on. Ancient texts rarely describe hidden activity in direct terms. They do not announce that something concealed is taking place, nor do they frame natural events as deliberate distractions in a modern sense. Instead, they rely on structure, placement, and omission. What happens behind a natural event is not highlighted as secret. It is simply positioned where attention is already diminished. To understand this, one must read these texts not as linear narratives, but as layered records in which meaning often resides in what is adjacent rather than what is explicit. In Sumerian cosmology, the natural world is never neutral. Rivers, storms, droughts, and seasons are not treated as background conditions. They are active components of order. When something significant occurs, it almost always coincides with a change in the environment. This is not because the environment causes the action, but because it marks the conditions under which action becomes possible without resistance. The texts assume that when nature shifts, boundaries soften. The separation of heaven and earth is the earliest example. The texts describe a time when these realms were joined, followed by a violent act that created space between them. This act is framed as a cosmic event, yet what follows is more important than the act itself. Once separation occurs, movement begins, domains are assigned, roles emerge. None of this is dramatized. It unfolds quietly in the space created by disruption. The disruption is loud. The reorganization is silent. Flood narratives follow the same pattern. The flood itself is described vividly. Winds rage, waters rise, cities vanish. Human attention is consumed entirely by survival. Then the waters recede and the text becomes restrained. What happens during the receding is not detailed. We are told that order returns, that kingship resumes, that boundaries are re-established. The mechanics of this transition are left unspoken. Activity occurs, but it is not foregrounded. This pattern repeats across multiple compositions. Storms appear before decisions. Darkness precedes judgment. Silence follows intervention. The natural event functions as a veil, not because it is artificial, but because it overwhelms perception. Ancient authors understood that during upheaval, observers focus on what threatens them directly. Peripheral movement goes unnoticed. The Anunnaki are introduced within this framework. They are not depicted arriving during calm skies or peaceful seasons. They appear once structure exists and disruption has already done its work. Their role is not to create chaos, but to operate within the aftermath of it. They judge. They assign fate. They determine outcomes. These activities are administrative, not theatrical. They take place where attention has already shifted elsewhere. In the texts, the underworld plays a crucial role in this logic. It is described not as a place of constant darkness, but as a domain governed by rules distinct from the surface world. Movement into and out of it is often associated with natural transitions. A goddess descends during a time of imbalance. A god emerges after ritual and delay. The boundary is crossed when the world above is already unsettled. Natural events are therefore not depicted as covers in a conspiratorial sense, but as thresholds. They mark moments when the normal order is suspended, allowing other forms of order to assert themselves without contest. The texts assume that authority does not need spectacle to function. It needs conditions that minimize interference. One of the most consistent indicators of hidden activity in these records is narrative compression. Large spans of time pass in a single line. Generations are summarized. Decisions are implied rather than explained. When this compression coincides with environmental disruption, it signals that something important has occurred without being narrated fully. The reader is expected to infer continuity without details. Another indicator is the reassignment of roles following natural events. After floods, certain gods gain prominence while others recede. After storms, new rituals appear. After periods of cold or famine, social structures change. The texts rarely describe these changes as reactions. They are presented as outcomes already decided. The implication is that decisions occurred earlier during the disruption, when human agency was diminished. The language used reinforces this interpretation. Verbs shift from active to passive. Actions happen without clear agents. Fates are fixed. Decrees are established. The emphasis moves away from process and toward result. This linguistic shift mirrors the conceptual shift from observable activity to concealed administration. Ancient authors were not attempting to mislead. They were encoding reality according to their worldview. In that worldview, not all activity was meant to be witnessed. Some actions belong to domains beyond ordinary perception. Natural events mark the times when these domains brushed against the human world. Weather, in particular, functions as a boundary phenomenon. It originates above the earth, but affects life below. It moves through the air, the realm between heaven and ground. In Sumerian thought, this realm belongs to Enlil, whose authority is tied to storms, winds, and disruption. When weather intensifies, Enlil's domain expands. This expansion is not symbolic, it is functional. The air becomes active, control shifts. Texts associated with Enlil often coincide with moments of adjustment. Flood decisions originate with him. Storms enforce boundaries. Noise complaints lead to intervention. These are not moral judgments. They are administrative responses to imbalance. The natural event provides cover not by intention, but by jurisdiction. When the air dominates, other authorities act within its shadow. Silence within the text is another marker. After a natural catastrophe, gods speak less. Human voices diminish. Narration becomes sparse. This silence is not absence of story. It is space for unrecorded action. The assumption is that readers understand what silence implies. Something is being handled elsewhere. Later traditions preserve this logic even as details change. In Akkadian texts, storms precede divine counsels. In Hebrew narratives, darkness precedes covenant shifts. In Greek myth, winter marks the withdrawal of a goddess and the suspension of growth. The pattern remains consistent. Natural events create temporal windows in which transitions occur. These windows are not random. They appear at points of systemic stress, when populations grow too large, when noise becomes excessive, when balance tilts. The natural event is not punishment alone, it is recalibration. The activity that follows is not hidden out of malice, but because it belongs to a level of reality not meant for continuous observation. The absence of explicit description does not weaken this interpretation, it strengthens it. Ancient texts are explicit when they want something remembered precisely. They are vague when they want something acknowledged without detail. Hidden activity resides in that vagueness. Modern readers often expect revelation. Ancient readers expected continuity. The purpose of the text was not to expose every mechanism, but to ensure that order remained intelligible. Too much detail would invite challenge. Silence preserved authority. When applied to modern events, this framework does not require belief in literal gods acting behind storms. It requires recognition that systems, ancient or modern, operate more effectively when attention is constrained. Disruption narrows focus. Narrowed focus allows adjustment. Adjustment occurs quietly. The ancient texts describe this dynamic repeatedly, though never in analytical terms. They show it through sequence, through pacing, through what is said and what is left unsaid. Natural events are the loudest part of the story because they are meant to be. They occupy attention fully. Everything else recedes. The Anunnaki, when they appear, do so after the noise subsides. Their judgments are final because they are unobserved. By the time humans notice change, it has already been decided. Fate is not imposed visibly. It is revealed gradually through consequence. This approach to activity does not rely on secrecy as a tactic. It relies on inevitability. When the world is disrupted, something must reorganize. The texts assume that this reorganization does not need announcement. It simply occurs. Ancient scribes trusted this logic enough to encode it consistently. They did not explain it because explanation would undermine its function. To name hidden activity explicitly would be to expose it to resistance. By allowing natural events to dominate narrative space, they ensured that deeper processes remained unquestioned. As the pattern repeats across cultures and centuries, it becomes clear that ancient people did not see natural events as isolated incidents. They saw them as signals, not warnings of danger alone, but indicators that something else was underway beyond immediate perception. This understanding does not resolve into a single conclusion. It establishes a method of reading, one that pays attention to timing, omission, and aftermath rather than spectacle. It suggests that when the world becomes noisy, something else becomes quiet by necessity, and it is within that quiet that decisions are made. The texts do not invite belief so much as recognition. Recognition that disruption and hidden activity are structurally linked, not because of deception, but because of how attention functions. The storm fills the field of view. What moves behind it does not need to hide. It simply waits for the moment when no one is looking directly at it, and the narrative continues without closure, carrying the pattern forward into whatever comes next. Early mythology does not treat storms as the origin of change. Instead, storms are positioned as thresholds, moments when the surface of the world becomes unstable enough for deeper processes to proceed without interference. This distinction is subtle but consistent. The storm is not the cause of what follows. It is the condition that makes what follows possible. To read ancient myth as if storms were explanatory endpoints is to miss how these narratives were constructed and what they were meant to preserve. In many early traditions, causality is deliberately displaced. Actions that determine outcomes occur before or after the storm, rarely during it, and almost never because of it. The storm occupies narrative space, absorbing attention, while decisions, reassignments, and recalibrations happen elsewhere. This pattern appears so frequently that it suggests intentional design rather than coincidence. The Sumerian flood narrative is the clearest example. The flood is devastating, totalizing, and overwhelming. It dominates the story. Yet the decision to destroy humanity occurs before the waters rise, in a divine assembly that debates noise, population, and imbalance. The solution to preserve a remnant is also decided before the storm begins, quietly, through indirect communication. The flood itself causes nothing. It executes what has already been determined. It is cover in the sense that it conceals the process, leaving only the outcome visible. This logic recurs in storm-related myths across cultures. In Akkadian literature, violent winds accompany moments when authority is asserted or withdrawn. The wind does not decide, it enforces. In Egyptian mythology, chaos manifests through environmental disorder when Ma'at is disrupted, but restoration occurs through ritual and decree, not through weather. The storm signals imbalance. The correction happens outside its frame. Early Greek mythology follows the same structure. Zeus does not gain authority because he controls storms. He controls storms because he already holds authority. Thunder and lightning do not create order. They mark its presence. When storms appear in myth, they are declarations, not engines. They announce that something is underway that cannot be challenged directly. This distinction matters because it reframes how storms function symbolically. They are not explanations. They are distractions. They draw attention away from processes that would otherwise provoke resistance or scrutiny. In mythological terms, storms silence dissent not through force, but through occupation. When survival is at stake, interpretation narrows. Ancient storytellers understood this intuitively. Their audiences lived in environments where storms could erase years of labour in hours. Attention during such events was absolute. There was no capacity to observe anything beyond immediate threat. Myth encodes this reality by allowing storms to dominate narrative space while leaving the actual reordering of power implicit. The Anunnaki fit precisely within this framework. They are never portrayed as storm gods. They are not associated with thunder, rain, or wind directly. Their domain is judgment, decree, and fate. They act when outcomes are fixed, not when chaos is unleashed. If storms appear alongside them, it is not as their tool, but as their cover. This separation is deliberate. Storm gods like Enlil occupy the domain of disruption. The Anunnaki occupy the domain of resolution. Confusing the two collapses the structure of the myth. The storm creates the conditions under which judgment can be enacted without interference. It clears the surface so that deeper authority can operate. Early mythology repeatedly emphasizes that storms do not change the nature of reality. They suspend its visibility. Fields disappear under water. Cities vanish beneath snow or ash. Familiar landmarks dissolve. In this temporary erasure, the world becomes abstract. Boundaries lose definition. It is in this abstracted state that transitions occur. The texts rarely describe what happens during this abstraction. Instead, they jump forward. After the storm, something is different. A king reigns where another once stood. A boundary exists where none did before. A rule is enforced that was previously absent. The storm explains none of this directly. It merely provides narrative cover. This pattern extends beyond floods and into lesser storms. In Sumerian hymns and incantations, sudden winds are associated with the removal of impurity or excess. The wind does not decide what is impure. That decision has already been made. The wind enacts removal without explanation. The result appears inevitable. Even drought functions similarly. When rain fails, texts describe divine displeasure, but resolution comes through ritual, negotiation, or substitution, not through the return of rain alone. The drought forces attention inward. The solution emerges quietly, often through reassignment of responsibility or alteration of practice. What distinguishes storms as cover rather than cause is the way agency is displaced. Humans suffer the storm. Gods decide outcomes elsewhere. This preserves divine authority by insulating it from immediate accountability. If the storm were the cause, it could be blamed. As cover, it deflects blame while enabling change. Ancient audiences accepted this structure because it mirrored lived experience. When disaster strikes, explanations often arrive after the fact. Decisions are made behind closed doors. Those affected experience impact without insight. Myth reflects this asymmetry, rather than correcting it. The storm also provides temporal cover. Time behaves differently during disruption. Days blur. Records cease. Calendars lose relevance. Ancient texts mark these periods as liminal, outside ordinary chronology. When time is suspended, actions taken within it are difficult to anchor precisely. They resist later reconstruction. This temporal ambiguity protects the authority of what follows. If no one can point to the exact moment a decision was made, it becomes part of the fabric of reality rather than a discrete choice. Storms enable this ambiguity naturally. They disrupt record-keeping, communication and observation simultaneously. In early mythology, the aftermath of storms often includes new prohibitions or constraints. After the flood, human lifespans are reduced. After divine withdrawal, access is limited. These changes are not debated publicly within the myth. They are presented as fate's accomplice. The storm absorbs the shock. The rule persists. This is why storms recur in stories of transition rather than origin. Creation myths may involve separation or emergence, but storms appear when adjustment is required. They are maintenance events, not founding events. They recalibrate rather than invent. The Anunnaki's association with the underworld reinforces this logic. The underworld is a place of fixed outcomes, not dynamic action. Judgments there are final. Storms above ground create the conditions under which such judgments can be enacted without contest. The worlds align briefly, then separate again. Early mythology does not require that storms be engineered or controlled. Their power lies in predictability of effect, not in origin. Whether natural or divine, storms reliably narrow attention and suspend normal order. This reliability makes them useful narrative tools without needing further explanation. Modern interpretations often search for intent behind storms. Ancient narratives rarely do. Intent resides elsewhere. The storm is treated as a known quantity. What matters is what it allows to happen while no one is watching closely. This understanding changes how early myths should be read. Rather than asking what caused the storm, the more revealing question is what changed afterward, and who benefited from that change. Myth answers this obliquely, through lineage shifts, altered decrees, and revised boundaries. Storms, in this sense, are neutral instruments. They do not choose sides, they clear space. Authority moves through that space invisibly. When the storm ends, the movement is complete. This pattern is consistent enough across cultures that it suggests a shared cognitive strategy rather than isolated belief. Humans recognize that disruption creates opportunity, not only for destruction, but for reorganization. Myth encoded this recognition in durable form. To say that storms act as cover rather than cause is not to attribute malice or manipulation. It is to recognize structural alignment. The storm does what storms do. Systems adjust because they must. Authority asserts itself because it can. Early mythology preserves this alignment without commentary. It does not justify it. It does not condemn it. It records it as fact. The world becomes noisy. Decisions become quiet. When calm returns, the decision remains. As the narrative continues forward, this framework becomes increasingly important, not because it proves anything, but because it establishes how attention, disruption, and authority interact across time. Storms fill the sky, something else moves beneath them, and when the clouds clear, the movement is already finished, leaving only its consequences to be noticed slowly, if at all, as the story carries on without pause. The association between the Anunnaki and atmospheric control is not presented in ancient texts as a matter of technological dominance or overt manipulation, but as a consequence of jurisdiction. The atmosphere in early Mesopotamian cosmology is not empty space. It is an active domain, a zone of authority situated between heaven and earth, where movement, transmission, and mediation occur. To understand how the Anunnaki relate to this domain, it is necessary to abandon modern expectations of control and replace them with the ancient concept of governance through order rather than force. In Sumerian thought, the world is structured vertically. Above lies the realm of An, the sky itself, distant and largely inaccessible. Below lies the earth, Ki, the domain of human labour, cities and agriculture. Between them stretches the air, the realm of wind, breath, weather, and sound. This middle space is not neutral. It is the most dynamic layer of reality, where change manifests visibly and invisibly. Control over this realm does not belong to creators, but to regulators. Enlil is traditionally identified as the primary authority over the air. He's not merely a storm god in the narrow sense. He governs breath, voice, command, and transmission. His decrees travel through the air. His anger manifests as wind. His presence is felt rather than seen. This makes the atmosphere the medium of power rather than its source. The air carries authority downward and consequences outward. The Anunnaki are not described as belonging to Enlil's domain directly, yet their function intersects with it repeatedly. They are judges, determiners of fate, and administrators of outcomes. Their decisions do not originate in the sky, nor do they dwell permanently among humans. They operate within the structure that Enlil's separation created. Their authority is exercised once boundaries exist and must be maintained. This is where atmospheric association emerges. The atmosphere is the zone where divine decisions become human experience. A decree made in a divine assembly manifests on Earth as altered weather, failed harvests, or disrupted cycles. The Anunnaki do not cause these manifestations. They define the conditions under which they occur. Their role is indirect but decisive. Ancient texts emphasize that fate is fixed before it is felt. When the Anunnaki sit in judgment, outcomes are determined in advance. What follows unfolds according to those determinations. Storms, droughts, and cold are expressions of that unfolding, not the moment of decision itself. The atmosphere becomes the delivery mechanism through which fate is enacted. This distinction is crucial. Modern interpretations often assume that control implies intervention. Ancient cosmology assumes that control implies alignment. To govern the atmosphere is not to manipulate it actively, but to ensure that it responds appropriately to underlying order. The Anunnaki's authority operates at the level of rule setting rather than event management. In the mythological record, when atmospheric disruption occurs, it is often preceded by deliberation. Noise complaints are heard, population thresholds are assessed, balance is evaluated. These assessments take place in divine assemblies, not in the clouds. Once decisions are made, the atmosphere responds in predictable ways. Storms arise, winds intensify, cold settles. These responses are not improvisations. They are consequences. The Anunnaki's association with the underworld reinforces this pattern. The underworld is the domain of finality. Nothing returns unchanged. Fate there is sealed. Atmospheric phenomena, by contrast, are transient. They arrive and pass. Their purpose is not permanence, but transition. They mark the movement from one state to another. The Anunnaki oversee the outcome of that movement, not its temporary expression. This is why they are often present in stories that involve thresholds rather than origins. In the descent of Inanna, the atmosphere does not play a dramatic role. The journey downward is quiet. Judgment occurs in silence. The return, however, coincides with changes in the world above. Fertility pauses, growth halts. These atmospheric effects signal that a decision has been made elsewhere. In later traditions influenced by Sumerian thought, this logic persists. Storms are associated with authority, but not creativity. They enforce boundaries. They limit movement. They remind humanity of scale. The Anunnaki remain behind the scenes, ensuring that these reminders align with predetermined outcomes. The idea of atmospheric control, then, is not about command of wind or temperature. It is about stewardship of conditions under which life operates. Ancient societies understood that the atmosphere governed survival. Too much rain destroys crops. Too little causes famine. Excessive cold halts growth. Stability lies within narrow margins. To oversee those margins is to hold power over civilization itself. The Anunnaki's authority touches these margins indirectly. They do not adjust rainfall by hand. They determine whether abundance or scarcity is appropriate. The atmosphere responds accordingly. This layered system preserves hierarchy. No single entity appears responsible for suffering. Responsibility is distributed across domains. This distribution is intentional. It prevents challenge. Humans may curse the storm, but they cannot argue with fate. They may appease Enlil through ritual, but the Anunnaki's judgments remain beyond appeal. The atmosphere absorbs blame. Authority remains intact. In early texts, this system is treated as normal. It is not questioned. It is explained through narrative repetition rather than doctrine. Storms follow decisions. Decisions precede storms. The order is consistent enough that audiences internalize it without needing explicit instruction. This consistency also explains why the Anunnaki are never depicted intervening visibly during storms. They do not appear riding winds or commanding clouds. Their presence is implied through outcome. When a storm results in lasting change, their authority is assumed. In modern terms, this resembles governance through policy rather than action. A regulation is enacted. Its effects ripple outward through systems. No single administrator appears on the ground. Yet the outcome reflects intentional structure. Ancient myth encoded this understanding long before bureaucratic systems formalized it. The atmosphere, as the most sensitive layer of the world, responds quickly to imbalance. Ancient observers knew this intimately. They lived by weather. They watched skies for signs. They recorded anomalies carefully. When patterns broke, they assumed higher-order causes, not because they lacked meteorology, but because they recognized systemic vulnerability. The Anunnaki's association with atmospheric effects therefore reflects awareness of leverage. Whoever governs the conditions of air governs the conditions of life, not directly, but inexorably. This governance does not require spectacle. It requires timing. Storms are effective not because they are violent, but because they are immersive. They occupy attention completely. While humans endure them, larger processes can proceed without resistance. Ancient texts do not frame this as deception. They frame it as order. This understanding also explains why atmospheric events are rarely individualized in myth. Storms are described generically. What matters is not their uniqueness, but their function. They serve as markers of transition. The Anunnaki's role is confirmed by what follows, not by what occurs in the sky. In the context of a winter storm, this association becomes clearer. Cold restricts movement. Silence spreads. Observation narrows. Systems slow. These are ideal conditions for adjustment. Ancient texts would not describe such adjustment directly. They would record that after the cold, something had changed. The Anunnaki, as arbiters of fate, would be assumed to have acted, not because they appeared, but because outcomes aligned with necessity. Their authority is inferred, not witnessed. This indirectness is not a weakness of the mythology. It is its strength. It mirrors how power actually operates across time, rarely through visible force, often through conditions that make alternatives impossible. The association with atmospheric control is therefore not about mastery of nature in a mechanical sense. It is about alignment with natural systems that already govern attention, survival, and continuity. The Anunnaki's role is to ensure that alignment serves order rather than chaos. As storms pass and skies clear, the atmosphere returns to neutrality. Authority recedes. The world resumes. What has been decided remains embedded in new conditions. Ancient texts move forward without explanation, assuming understanding. This assumption carries into every subsequent narrative. Storms come and go. Fate persists. The Anunnaki remain present without appearing, their association with the air not as controllers of wind, but as governors of what the wind makes possible. The story continues forward, not toward resolution, but deeper into the structure that connects disruption, authority, and the quiet permanence of outcome. Cold, darkness, and disruption appear together in the ancient tablets, not as poetic coincidence, but as a functional triad that signals transition. These elements are not metaphors layered for dramatic effect. They are conditions. When they emerge together, the texts indicate that ordinary structures have loosened and that a different mode of order is temporarily in effect. The repetition of this pattern across Sumerian and later Mesopotamian literature suggests deliberate encoding rather than symbolic excess. Cold in the ancient world was not merely discomfort, it was absence. Absence of growth, absence of sound, absence of movement. In a society whose survival depended on narrow environmental margins, cold represented the suspension of productivity itself. Fields lay dormant, rivers slowed, travel ceased. Cold created stillness not through force, but through limitation. When the tablets reference cold conditions, they are not describing weather alone. They are describing a world that has paused. Darkness functions similarly, but at a different layer. Darkness is not simply the lack of light. It is the loss of visibility and orientation. In the texts, darkness frequently appears when boundaries are crossed or when authority shifts. The sun withdraws. The stars vanish. Timekeeping becomes uncertain. Darkness collapses distinction. Without light, hierarchy blurs. Heaven and earth feel closer. Surface and depth become harder to separate. Disruption binds these two together. It is the experiential result of cold and darkness acting in concert. Systems fail. Routines break. Predictability dissolves. Disruption is not an independent force in the tablets. It is what happens when conditions remove the supports that keep order visible. Cold halts activity. Darkness obscures structure. Disruption follows naturally. The tablets do not present this triad as punishment alone. It is not always framed as divine anger or moral correction. In many cases it precedes reorganization rather than destruction. The world does not end, it recalibrates. Cold and darkness clear the surface of habitual motion. Disruption opens space. In Sumerian cosmology, creation itself emerges from a state that resembles this triad. Before separation, before differentiation, there is no light in the human sense. There is no warmth. There is no structured activity. The primordial state is undifferentiated and inert. When the tablets reference cold and darkness together, they evoke this pre-structured condition, not as a return to chaos, but as a reminder of the substrate beneath order. This association becomes clearer in flood narratives. Although floods involve water rather than cold directly, the aftermath often includes extended periods of darkness and cooling. Storm clouds obscure the sky, sunlight disappears, temperatures drop. The world becomes uninhabitable, not because it is violent, but because it is unresponsive. Life cannot proceed normally. Attention turns inward. Cold amplifies this inward turn. Humans retreat indoors. Communities contract. Communication narrows. In ancient cities, this meant temples closed, markets halted, and travel stopped. The social world shrank. Authority centralized or disappeared from view. The tablets consistently position important transitions within this contraction. Darkness reinforces it by removing reference points. Without clear markers of time and space, experience becomes fluid. In such conditions, the ordinary sequencing of cause and effect weakens. The tablets often exploit this ambiguity. Events occur without clear temporal anchors. Decisions seem to emerge fully formed rather than developed. Disruption, then, is not the goal. It is the effect of removing stabilizing conditions. When cold and darkness converge, disruption is inevitable. The texts do not lament this. They treat it as necessary. Something must be cleared before something else can be established. This logic appears in myths involving descent. When a deity descends into the underworld, the world above often enters a period of stagnation. Crops fail, sexual activity ceases, growth pauses. These effects are not caused by the underworld itself, but by the absence created by descent. Cold and darkness describe that absence experientially. The tablets rarely describe these periods in detail. They note their presence and then move on. This brevity is telling. The focus is not on suffering, but on transition. The audience is expected to recognize the pattern without needing elaboration. In administrative terms, cold and darkness reduce oversight from below. Human agency diminishes. In such conditions, higher-order decisions encounter less resistance. Ancient societies understood that collective action is difficult when survival becomes the sole concern. The tablets reflect this understanding without stating it explicitly. The Anunnaki are consistently associated with moments when this triad is present or has just passed. They do not appear amid abundance and clarity. They appear when conditions have stripped away excess. Their judgments occur in silence. Their decrees are enacted when no alternative narratives can form. This does not imply malice. It implies efficiency. Authority operates best when interference is minimal. Cold and darkness create that minimization naturally. Disruption ensures compliance without enforcement. In later Mesopotamian texts, Extended winters and periods of darkness are sometimes linked to cosmic imbalance rather than localized disaster. The implication is that these conditions reflect adjustments at a systemic level. Something is being corrected. The surface world feels the effect, not the cause. Modern readers often interpret cold and darkness as symbols of fear or evil. The tablets do not support this simplification. These conditions are neutral tools within a larger order. They are uncomfortable, but not malevolent. They serve function rather than expression. The pairing of cold and darkness also removes witnesses. Fewer people are present, fewer activities occur, records thin, oral transmission slows. This thinning of record is crucial. It allows later narratives to present outcomes without contesting details. Memory becomes generalized. Authority remains unchallenged. In agricultural societies, cold and darkness coincide with the non-growing season. This is when planning occurs. Decisions are made for the coming year. Seeds are stored. Labor is reassigned. The tablets reflect this rhythm at a cosmic scale. The world pauses. Decisions are made. Activity resumes altered. Disruption, therefore, is not failure. It is intermission. The tablets encode this repeatedly. After disruption, something new is in place. Not always visibly different, but structurally adjusted. The emphasis on togetherness matters. Cold alone is survivable. Darkness alone is navigable. Disruption alone is manageable. Together they overwhelm ordinary coping mechanisms. They force reliance on established authority or tradition. They suppress innovation temporarily. This creates stability of a different kind. Ancient authors did not need to explain this explicitly because their audiences lived it. Winters were known. Darkness was feared. Disruption was familiar. The mythological framework elevated these experiences into markers of larger processes. In this framework, natural events are not isolated. They are coordinated in effect, not in origin. Cold arrives. Darkness follows. Disruption settles. The order of appearance is less important than their convergence. The tablets also show that once this convergence ends, clarity returns gradually. Light reappears, warmth increases, activity resumes. The new order feels natural because it emerges alongside relief. Gratitude replaces scrutiny. This emotional shift further reduces resistance. The Anunnaki's role becomes visible only through consequence. Fate has shifted. Boundaries are adjusted. Lifespans shorten. Access is limited. These changes persist long after the cold has receded. The storm is forgotten. The adjustment remains. This persistence is the key. The tablets are less concerned with the discomfort of cold than with the durability of what follows. Temporary suffering enables permanent structure. Darkness also carries legal implications in the texts. Courts pause. Judgments are delayed. Silence reigns. When judgment resumes, it appears decisive. The Anunnaki, as judges, are associated with this decisiveness. Their authority is reinforced by the contrast between confusion and clarity. Cold, darkness, and disruption thus function as preparatory conditions. They are not messages, they are settings. They frame the moment when the ordinary world steps back and something else takes precedence. This pattern appears again and again because it reflects how change is managed without collapse. Abrupt change invites rebellion. Gradual change invites debate. Change enacted during disruption encounters neither. Ancient myth preserves this strategy without moralizing it. It is presented as how the world works. When stability breaks, deeper structures assert themselves. In the context of a winter storm, this triad becomes immediately recognizable. Cold restricts movement. Darkness shortens days and limits visibility. Disruption follows as systems strain. Attention narrows. Memory shortens. The conditions described in the tablets reappear without mythological framing. The persistence of this pattern across millennia suggests that it is not tied to specific beliefs, but to structural realities of human systems. Disruption is not random, it is patterned, and cold and darkness are reliable ways to induce it. The tablets do not conclude these episodes with explanation, they move forward. The reader is left to infer continuity. This is not an oversight, it is method. The narrative does not close, it carries on. Cold fades. Light returns, order stabilizes. The world feels familiar again, though subtly changed. The tablets record the change, not the discomfort. The storm is background. The adjustment is foregrounded only by its endurance. This is why cold, darkness, and disruption appear together so consistently. They are not thematic embellishments, they are operational conditions. They prepare the world for shifts that are meant to persist quietly, without spectacle, without debate, and without finality, as the structure of the story continues onward. Moments when human attention is redirected elsewhere are treated in ancient texts not as incidental side effects of crisis, but as predictable phases within larger cycles of order and adjustment. Attention, in these records, is not a passive state. It is a resource. Where attention flows, resistance exists. Where attention collapses inward, authority moves outward. The tablets never name this dynamic explicitly, yet they describe it repeatedly through sequence, omission, and consequence. Human attention narrows under pressure. This is not a moral failing or a cultural trait. It is physiological and social. When survival becomes uncertain, perception prioritizes the immediate. Food, shelter, warmth, safety. Everything else recedes. Long-term thinking pauses. Abstract considerations dissolve. This narrowing is temporary, but its effects are profound. It creates intervals in which large-scale decisions can be enacted without contest or commentary. Ancient societies understood this instinctively because they lived close to thresholds. A failed harvest, a sudden flood, or an unexpected cold spell could destabilize entire regions. During such times, attention shifted away from governance, ritual precision, and communal memory toward endurance. The tablets record these shifts indirectly. Markets fall silent. Temples close. Records cease. The absence of inscription is itself a marker of redirected attention. When attention turns inward, public space empties. Movement slows. Communication contracts. In the ancient world, this meant fewer witnesses, fewer conversations, fewer opportunities for dissent. Authority did not need to suppress opposition because opposition was occupied elsewhere. The texts do not frame this as manipulation. They present it as natural alignment. This alignment appears repeatedly in flood narratives. As waters rise, human attention is consumed entirely by survival. Families cling together, animals scatter, cities disappear. The flood dominates perception so completely that nothing else exists. During this total absorption, decisions are executed, boundaries are erased and redrawn. When attention returns after the waters recede, the new order is already in place. The crucial point is that the flood itself does not create the order. It removes the capacity to question it. The tablets move quickly from catastrophe to outcome. Kingship resumes, cities are rebuilt, laws are re-established. The intervening process is absent. Attention was elsewhere. This pattern extends beyond floods to quieter disruptions. Extended cold periods, droughts, eclipses, and storms all redirect attention in similar ways. Cold drives people indoors. Darkness limits movement. Drought focuses labour on water acquisition. Each condition reduces the scope of perception. Each narrows the field in which collective judgment might otherwise form. The tablets often describe these periods as times when the gods are silent or distant. This silence is not abandonment. It reflects the absence of human attention to divine nuance. Ritual becomes perfunctory, or pauses altogether. Interpretation halts. What remains is function. The Anunnaki, as figures associated with judgment and fate, are positioned precisely within these intervals. They do not appear when human attention is wide and active. They appear when attention has collapsed. Their judgments are described as final not because they are imposed violently, but because no competing narratives arise at the moment they are enacted. This dynamic becomes clearer when considering the role of noise in Mesopotamian texts. Noise is not merely sound. It represents activity, density, and assertion of presence. When humans are noisy, they are visible, they occupy space, they demand consideration. When noise diminishes, attention follows. The famous complaint of Enlil about human noise is often interpreted as petulance. A more structural reading suggests something else. Noise indicates unchecked expansion. It signals that human systems have grown too complex to manage within existing constraints. Redirecting attention through disruption reduces noise temporarily, allowing recalibration. The redirection of attention is therefore not incidental to divine action. It is prerequisite. Without it, change would provoke resistance. Ancient authors understood this not analytically but experientially. They saw how communities responded under strain. They encoded that response into mythic structure. Moments of redirected attention are often marked in the tablets by changes in pacing. Long lists of names and achievements abruptly halt. Narrative compresses. Time jumps forward. This compression mirrors the lived experience of crisis, where days blur and memory fragments. The text adopts the same rhythm as its subject. This adoption is deliberate. It aligns the reader's experience with the event. Just as attention narrows during disruption, the narrative narrows. Just as detail is lost during crisis, detail disappears from the record. The structure reinforces the content. In these moments, authority shifts upward or inward. Decisions are no longer negotiated publicly. They are assumed. The tablets describe decrees descending rather than emerging. Fate is fixed rather than debated. The redirection of attention makes this possible without explanation. This is not portrayed as unjust, it is portrayed as necessary. The ancient worldview did not prioritize individual agency during crisis. It prioritized continuity. Attention redirected elsewhere allows continuity to be preserved without collapse. The underworld plays a symbolic role here. It is a place without attention in the human sense. Souls do not observe or contest. They exist within fixed conditions. When figures descend into this realm, the world above often enters a state of stagnation. Attention withdraws, growth pauses. When the figure returns, order resumes altered. This descent as distraction pattern recurs in many traditions. A god disappears, the world falters, attention shifts to loss. During that interval, boundaries are adjusted. When attention returns, the new arrangement feels inevitable. The tablets do not describe resistance during these moments, because resistance requires attention. When attention is elsewhere, resistance cannot form. This is not coercion. It is structural inevitability. In later Mesopotamian texts, eclipses are treated similarly. An eclipse redirects attention skyward. Fear spreads. Rituals intensify. While focus is fixed on the heavens, terrestrial affairs pause. Political decisions made during such times carry weight because they encounter less scrutiny. This logic persists across cultures. In ancient China, eclipses were moments of imperial vulnerability and adjustment. In Mesoamerican societies, celestial events marked times of ritual recalibration. Everywhere, attention follows disruption. Modern societies experience the same redirection, though framed differently. During disasters, attention focuses on news updates, safety instructions, and immediate logistics. Broader questions pause. Policy shifts occur quietly. Temporary measures become permanent. Once attention returns, the new status quo is accepted. The ancient texts capture this pattern without moral judgment. They present it as how change occurs without fracture. Attention must be redirected for systems to adjust smoothly. Sudden visibility invites backlash. Quiet adjustment ensures continuity. The Anunnaki's authority is reinforced by this mechanism. Their judgments are unchallengeable, not because they are enforced violently, but because they occur when challenge is impossible. Human attention is elsewhere. By the time attention returns, outcomes have solidified. This does not require deception. It requires timing. Ancient authors understood timing intuitively. They saw when people were most receptive to change and when they were most likely to resist it. They encoded this understanding into mythic sequence. Moments of redirected attention are also moments of vulnerability. This vulnerability is not always exploited. Often, it is simply navigated. Systems adapt. Structures adjust. What matters is that adaptation occurs without destabilizing the whole. The tablets often resume detailed narration only after attention has returned. Names reappear, lineages continue, laws are enumerated. The reader senses that something significant has occurred in the interim, but the text does not dwell on it. The gap is accepted. This acceptance reflects cultural trust in authority. When attention returns, the new order is treated as legitimate because it emerged during a time when legitimacy was not questioned. The process is invisible. The result is durable. Moments when human attention is redirected elsewhere are therefore not interruptions in history. They are mechanisms within it. They allow history to turn without tearing. The modern inclination to fill these moments with speculation reflects discomfort with silence. Ancient cultures were more comfortable with it. Silence indicated that something was being handled at a level beyond ordinary participation. This comfort did not imply ignorance. It implied understanding of limits. Not all processes are meant to be observed. Not all decisions are meant to be debated. Some occur when attention is naturally constrained. The persistence of this pattern suggests that it is rooted in human cognition rather than belief. Attention is finite. When it is consumed by survival, governance shifts. This is as true now as it was thousands of years ago. In the context of a storm, attention turns to warmth, shelter, and continuity. Everything else recedes. The storm does not need to conceal anything actively. Attention does the work. The tablets show that once attention returns, memory is selective. People remember the hardship. They remember survival. They rarely remember the precise moment when things changed. That moment occurred while they were looking elsewhere. This selectivity preserves stability. Without it, societies would be trapped in perpetual re-evaluation. By allowing change to occur during distraction, continuity is maintained. Moments when human attention is redirected elsewhere are therefore not accidental gaps. They are structural intervals. They enable adjustment without rupture. They allow authority to function without confrontation. Ancient texts preserve this logic faithfully. They do not dramatize it. They rely on the reader's familiarity with disruption to supply understanding. The storm, the cold, the darkness, the crisis. These are signals. Attention has shifted. What follows is never explained fully because it does not need to be. By the time the story resumes, the outcome is already integrated into the world. The narrative continues forward, not by resolving the gap, but by building upon it, carrying the pattern onward without pause, without conclusion, and without demanding belief, only recognition of how attention shapes the movement of history. Infrastructure strain is rarely experienced as a single moment of failure. It is felt as pressure accumulating across systems that were designed to operate just below their limits. Ancient societies did not use the word infrastructure, yet their texts reveal a precise awareness of what happens when the supporting structures of daily life are stretched thin. Roads, canals, granaries, temples, and administrative hierarchies all had thresholds. When those thresholds were approached simultaneously, movement became possible in ways that were otherwise constrained. The tablets describe this indirectly, through moments when maintenance ceases to be routine and becomes urgent. Canals clog, walls crack, storehouses empty faster than expected. Priests complain of shortages. Scribes stop recording ordinary transactions. These are not portrayed as disasters, they are portrayed as warning conditions. The system is under strain, and strain alters timing. Timing is critical. Movement that occurs when systems are robust leaves traces. It is noticed, recorded, questioned. Movement that occurs when systems are strained blends into emergency response. It is mistaken for repair, redistribution, or temporary improvisation. The difference is not intent, but context. Ancient Mesopotamian cities were dense nodes of dependency. Food, water, labour and authority converged within narrow geographic spaces. A disruption in one area propagated quickly. Flooding strained canals. Flooded canals strained agriculture. Agricultural strain produced unrest. Unrest required administrative response. Each layer of response consumed resources that would otherwise maintain oversight. The tablets often describe such periods with phrases indicating haste or burden. Work is heavy. The gods labour. The people groan. These descriptions are not poetic embellishments. They reflect recognition that when maintenance becomes overwhelming, priorities shift. Preservation replaces observation. Infrastructure strain narrows options. Decisions that would normally require consensus are made unilaterally. Movements that would normally require announcement are carried out quietly. Temporary measures are implemented without documentation. In the ancient world, this meant reallocating labour, diverting water, sealing gates, or abandoning sites. The texts note outcomes without detailing process. This omission is not accidental. During strain, process becomes secondary. What matters is continuity. Ancient scribes recorded what endured, not what was improvised. Improvisation belonged to the realm of crisis, not history. As a result, movement that occurred during strain is preserved only through consequence. Timing intersects with this dynamic in predictable ways. Movement is most effective when it coincides with peak strain, not with collapse. If systems collapse entirely, movement becomes impossible. If systems remain stable, movement attracts scrutiny. The optimal moment lies between these extremes. The tablets implicitly recognize this. Major shifts occur not during the height of catastrophe, but during periods of extended pressure. After the floodwaters rise but before they recede fully. During long winters rather than sudden freezes. Amid famine rather than after starvation. These are intervals when systems are stressed but still functioning. During such intervals, infrastructure absorbs anomalies. Unaccounted labour can be attributed to repair. Unusual transport can be explained as redistribution. Missing records can be blamed on damage. Silence becomes plausible. Ancient texts repeatedly describe journeys, descents, or relocations that occur during these intervals. A god travels while the world is unstable. A king moves his seat during unrest. A boundary shifts quietly. The timing is never emphasized explicitly. It is embedded in context. The Anunnaki, associated with judgment and administration, are positioned within these contexts. They do not move during times of ease. They appear when systems are already burdened. Their activity aligns with moments when infrastructure strain limits oversight. This alignment is not described as strategy. It is presented as inevitability. When strain exists, adjustment follows. The texts assume this sequence as natural. They do not question it, because it mirrors lived experience. Infrastructure strain also affects perception of scale. During stable periods, small movements are noticeable. During strained periods, even large movements can be overlooked if they resemble necessary response. Ancient cities were accustomed to mobilization during crisis. Workers moved. Supplies shifted. Authority travelled. Not all movement was noteworthy. The tablets reflect this familiarity. They do not linger on logistics during crisis. They note that something was done, not how. This lack of detail creates space for activity that does not fit neatly into categories of ritual or governance. It disappears into the background of necessity. Timing also affects memory. Events that occur during strain are remembered differently. They are associated with hardship rather than with specific actions. People remember the cold, the hunger, the repair work. They do not remember who moved where or when. The tablets preserve this selective memory by emphasizing conditions rather than actions. In later Mesopotamian records, periods of infrastructure strain often precede administrative reforms. New boundaries are drawn, responsibilities reassigned, laws updated. These reforms are presented as responses to prior conditions, not as outcomes of specific movements. The movement itself is invisible, the result is visible. This invisibility is reinforced by the rhythm of record keeping. During strain, record keeping slows or becomes irregular. Clay tablets crack, archives flood, scribes prioritize essential decrees. Once stability returns, new records begin, often without reference to what occurred in the interim. The gap becomes normalized. Modern infrastructure operates on similar principles, though at vastly greater scale. Power grids, communication networks, transportation systems and data centers are designed with redundancy, but not infinite capacity. When strain accumulates, systems enter degraded modes. Monitoring becomes less granular. Response focuses on stabilization rather than investigation. During such modes, movement that would normally be flagged becomes routine. Vehicles reroute. Data packets shift paths. Personnel are reassigned. These movements are logged minimally or not at all. Once normal operations resume, the transient state is forgotten. Ancient texts capture the essence of this without technical language. They show that strain alters not only capacity, but awareness. When awareness is altered, timing matters more than action. A movement made at the wrong time attracts notice. The same movement made under strain passes unnoticed. The concept of timing is central to divine authority in these texts. Decrees are said to be issued at appointed times. Festivals align with seasons. Judgments coincide with transitions. Authority is exercised not arbitrarily, but when conditions are receptive. Infrastructure strain creates such receptivity. Storms, cold, and darkness contribute to this by taxing systems unevenly. Roads become impassable. Storage fails. Communication slows. Each effect compounds the others. The result is a landscape where movement is constrained in some directions and facilitated in others. Those who understand this landscape can navigate it efficiently. The tablets do not describe this navigation explicitly. They assume it. The gods move when they must. Humans endure. Outcomes persist. The underworld again provides a conceptual parallel. It is a domain with fixed infrastructure. Gates, judges, rules. Movement there is restricted and purposeful. Entry and exit occur at specific times. These times often coincide with disruption above. The alignment is structural, not symbolic. Infrastructure strain also redistributes authority. Local leaders lose capacity. Central figures gain leverage. Decisions concentrate. This concentration simplifies movement at higher levels while complicating it at lower levels. The tablets reflect this shift through changes in narrative focus. Individual actions fade. Collective outcomes dominate. This fading is not loss of information. It is prioritization. Ancient authors preserved what mattered for continuity of order. Movement during strain mattered only insofar as it shaped outcomes. The Anunnaki's association with fate places them at the intersection of strain and timing. Fate is not changed casually. It is adjusted when conditions demand it. Infrastructure strain signals such demand. When systems approach limits, recalibration becomes necessary. The Anunnaki's judgments align with these moments. This does not imply that infrastructure strain causes divine action. It indicates that strain reveals necessity. The action responds to necessity, not to weather or material failure alone. In practical terms, strain compresses choice. Options narrow, paths converge. Decisions that would otherwise be debated become unavoidable. This compression is fertile ground for decisive movement. Ancient texts encode this through abrupt transitions. One state ends, another begins. The process between is absent. This absence is where movement hides, not because it is secret, but because it is unremarkable under the circumstances. When everything is strained, movement blends into response. Timing also affects legitimacy. Changes enacted during crisis are accepted more readily. They are seen as necessary rather than imposed. The tablets show this acceptance through lack of dissent. New arrangements appear without challenge. Authority is reaffirmed by survival. The persistence of this pattern across centuries suggests that ancient societies recognized a truth about systems that remains relevant. Infrastructure strain is not merely a risk. It is a moment of possibility. It allows adjustment without rupture. The texts do not moralize this. They do not praise or condemn it. They record it as fact. When strain appears, timing matters. Movement occurs, outcomes settle. As the narrative continues, this understanding becomes increasingly important. Events are not evaluated solely by what they disrupt, but by what they enable. Infrastructure strain is not an endpoint. It is a threshold. Storms, cold, and disruption create that threshold. Attention narrows. Oversight thins. Systems operate in degraded modes. Movement aligns with necessity rather than visibility. When stability returns, the movement has already occurred. The infrastructure is repaired. Records resume. The world appears continuous. Only the underlying configuration has shifted. The tablets proceed without comment. They assume comprehension. The reader is expected to recognize that timing, not force, governs effective movement. This recognition carries forward into every subsequent transition. Infrastructure strain does not announce opportunity. It creates it quietly. Those who understand timing act. Those who endure remember only the strain. The story moves on, not resolving this dynamic, but embedding it deeper into the structure of how change occurs. Infrastructure strains. Timing aligns. Movement happens. Outcomes persist. And the narrative continues without pause, without conclusion, and without demanding belief. Only attention to how systems behave when they are pressed just enough to bend without breaking. Earthbound activity is never described as overt in the ancient tablets, because overt action belongs to moments of creation or destruction, not to maintenance. The texts draw a clear, if often unspoken, distinction between events meant to be witnessed and processes meant to endure. What is visible invites reaction. What endures requires quiet. This is not a matter of secrecy, but of stability. The world described in the tablets is not governed through spectacle, but through alignment. Overt action attracts attention, and attention destabilizes systems already under strain. Ancient authors understood this intuitively. Their societies functioned through balance between human activity and environmental constraint, between ritual order and material necessity. Any action taken openly within this balance risked disruption. As a result, the most consequential activity is described obliquely or not at all. The earliest creation narratives illustrate this principle clearly. The separation of heaven and earth is described, but only once. It is singular, violent, and unmistakable. After this moment, overt action recedes. What follows is organization, assignment, and regulation. These processes are not dramatized. They unfold quietly. The gods do not announce each boundary or decree publicly. The structure simply exists. Earthbound activity, by definition, takes place within the realm of human perception. To act overtly, there would be to invite interference. The tablets reflect an understanding that lasting authority cannot rely on constant visibility. Visibility invites contest. Silence invites acceptance. This logic applies equally to divine and human actors within the texts. Kings who rule longest are rarely described performing dramatic feats. Their legitimacy is assumed. Kings who act overtly often appear briefly and disappear violently. The narrative pattern reinforces the idea that overt action signals instability rather than control. The Anunnaki, positioned as arbiters of fate, exemplify this restraint. They do not descend amid thunder or command attention through display. They sit, they judge, they fix outcomes. Their authority is conveyed through consequence, not appearance. The tablets describe what has been decided, not how the decision was enacted on the ground. This restraint is not accidental. It reflects an understanding of how legitimacy functions. Authority that must be seen repeatedly is authority under threat. Authority that is assumed requires no demonstration. The texts privilege the latter. Earthbound activity also carries risk of contradiction. If actions are described overtly, they can be compared, questioned, or reinterpreted by later generations. Silence avoids this. By leaving processes undescribed, the texts preserve coherence across time. Outcomes remain consistent even as interpretations vary. This approach mirrors administrative practice in ancient societies. Records focused on outcomes, harvest totals, boundary agreements, tribute lists. The day-to-day negotiations, conflicts and improvisations that produced those outcomes were rarely preserved. They were too contingent, too local, too unstable to be recorded meaningfully. The tablets adopt the same principle at cosmic scale. They record that humanity was created, not the debates that shaped its form. They record that lifespans were shortened, not the deliberations behind the decision. They record that kingship descended from heaven, not the mechanism by which it was transferred. Earthbound activity, when described at all, is often reframed as ritual rather than action. Ritual is visible, but it is repetitive and controlled. It does not introduce novelty, it reinforces order. By describing activity as ritual, the texts render it safe to observe. Novel action, by contrast, is dangerous. It threatens equilibrium. The tablets minimize its visibility accordingly. When novelty occurs, it is often attributed to boundary-crossing figures whose stories end in exile, punishment, or transformation. Overt action has consequences. This pattern also reflects the tablet's audience. These texts were preserved and transmitted by scribes attached to temples and courts. Their purpose was not to document every occurrence, but to maintain continuity of order. Recording overt earthbound activity that altered that order would undermine their role. The underworld again provides a contrast. There, overt description is possible because nothing changes. Gates are fixed, judges are seated, rules do not evolve. The static nature of that realm makes description safe. The surface world, by contrast, is dynamic. Describing its processes invites instability. Weather and natural events occupy a unique position. They are overt but impersonal. They can be described without assigning agency. This makes them ideal narrative anchors. The storm can be seen. The cold can be felt. The darkness can be acknowledged. What occurs alongside them can remain unspoken. This narrative strategy preserves plausibility. Readers accept that something changed because they experienced the disruption. They do not need to see the change enacted to believe it occurred. Their own memory fills the gap. Earthbound activity is therefore never described as overt because description itself would disrupt the balance the activity is meant to preserve. Silence is not absence of action. It is a condition for its success. The tablets repeatedly show that when action must be overt, it is framed as failure or emergency. The flood is overt because the system has already failed. The storm is overt because imbalance has reached visibility. These are not models for governance, they are warnings. Effective adjustment occurs elsewhere, earlier or later, outside the field of immediate perception. The texts encode this through pacing. They linger on disruption. They skip over resolution. The reader is carried forward into a world that feels continuous but is not identical. This continuity is crucial. Change that feels abrupt invites rejection. Change that feels natural invites compliance. By avoiding overt description of earthbound activity, the tablets ensure that change appears organic rather than imposed. The Anunnaki's role fits this logic precisely. As judges of fate, they do not need to appear physically. Their authority manifests as altered conditions. Humans experience these conditions as reality, not as intervention. There is nothing to resist. In modern terms, this resembles systemic change implemented through policy rather than enforcement. The rules change. The environment adapts. Individuals adjust behavior without witnessing the moment of decision. Ancient texts capture this dynamic in mythic form. Earthbound activity is also constrained by scale. Large movements require coordination. Coordination produces noise. Noise attracts attention. Attention destabilizes timing. By keeping activity non-overt, scale can be managed without friction. The tablets show awareness of this through their emphasis on delegation. Tasks are assigned. Domains are managed. No single figure appears everywhere at once. Authority flows through structure rather than presence. This structural flow allows activity to occur without spectacle. It also diffuses responsibility. No single agent can be blamed. The outcome simply exists. Readers often mistake this absence of overt action for absence of agency. The tablet suggests the opposite. Agency is most effective when it is least visible. This is not a moral statement, it is an observation. When earthbound activity is overt, it invites mythic inflation. Heroes emerge, conflicts escalate, narratives fracture. The tablets avoid this by reserving overt action for moments that must be remembered distinctly, usually because they mark the end of an era rather than the adjustment of one. This selective visibility creates a rhythm: overt disruption, quiet adjustment, stable outcome. The cycle repeats. The reader learns to recognize it without being told. Earthbound activity remains hidden not because it is forbidden to see, but because seeing it would interfere with its purpose. The texts assume that order is more important than transparency. Continuity outweighs explanation. As the narrative progresses, this pattern becomes increasingly familiar. The absence of overt description is no longer surprising. It is expected. The reader understands that when something significant changes without being shown, it changed during a moment when attention was elsewhere. This understanding does not conclude the story. It deepens it. Each subsequent disruption invites the same reading. What is visible absorbs attention. What matters proceeds quietly. The tablets do not resolve this tension. They rely on it. Earthbound activity remains undescribed because description would undermine the very stability the activity is meant to secure. The narrative continues forward, not toward revelation, but toward repetition of structure. Storms pass, cold recedes, darkness lifts, the world resumes. Something has shifted. No one saw it happen. And because no one saw it happen, it remains unchallenged, woven seamlessly into the fabric of what comes next. Sumerian records describe change not as a single motion, but as a sequence that unfolds in three recognizable phases: entry, adjustment, and withdrawal. These phases are not presented as a formula, nor are they labelled as such. They emerge through repetition, pacing, and narrative structure. When read across multiple compositions rather than in isolation, A consistent pattern becomes visible, one that reveals how presence is introduced, how systems are recalibrated, and how visibility recedes once stability is restored. Entry in the Sumerian text is rarely dramatic. It does not resemble invasion, arrival, or conquest. Instead, entry is marked by acknowledgement. A god is named, a function is assigned, a domain becomes active. The language used is restrained. There is no insistence on spectacle. Entry occurs when the world is already receptive, often after disruption has loosened established patterns. In the earliest cosmological texts, entry follows separation. Heaven and earth are divided. Space is created. Only then do figures emerge to inhabit and regulate that space. Entry is conditional. It depends on prior structural change. The texts do not describe beings forcing their way into an intact system. They appear once the system has already shifted. This logic applies equally to divine and semi-divine figures. Enki enters narratives once the cosmic framework exists. Inanna's appearances intensify when social or natural balance wavers. The Anunnaki appear after generational order is established, not before. Entry is always downstream of change, never its origin. Adjustment follows entry quietly. This is the longest and least described phase. Once presence is established, roles are clarified, boundaries are refined, and responsibilities are redistributed. The texts often summarize this phase in a single line, or skip it entirely. This omission is not accidental. Adjustment is not meant to be observed. It is meant to take hold. Administrative language dominates this phase when it appears at all. Duties are assigned, fates are fixed, cities are allotted. These actions are not dramatized. They are presented as completed facts. The implication is that adjustment occurs through process rather than event, through alignment rather than force. In the myth of humanity's creation, the entry of humans into the cosmic order is followed immediately by adjustment. Humans are assigned labour. Gods are relieved of burden. The text does not linger on how this transition unfolded socially or psychologically. It presents the result as natural and necessary. The adjustment phase is compressed because its success depends on lack of scrutiny. The Anunnaki's role is most visible here, though still indirectly. They are associated with decrees that finalize adjustment. Their judgments are not experiments, they confirm outcomes. When they appear, the adjustment phase is concluding. Fate is sealed. The system has found its new equilibrium. Withdrawal is the final phase, and it is as important as entry. Once adjustment is complete, visibility diminishes. Figures retreat from the foreground. Activity becomes embedded in structure rather than presence. The texts often note this withdrawal explicitly through silence. A god ceases to speak. A narrative shifts focus. Attention moves elsewhere. Withdrawal is not abandonment, it is confirmation. By withdrawing, authority signals that the system no longer requires direct intervention. Stability has been achieved. The world can operate within the newly established parameters. This pattern is especially clear in flood narratives. Divine attention intensifies before the flood. Decisions are made, instructions are given. During the flood itself, presence becomes diffuse. The gods retreat. After the flood, a brief moment of adjustment occurs. New rules are established. Then withdrawal follows. Gods return to their domains. Humans resume life under altered conditions. The same pattern appears in the descent of Inanna. Entry into the underworld is deliberate. Adjustment occurs through judgment and substitution. Withdrawal restores balance to both realms. The text focuses not on the mechanics of negotiation, but on the shift in conditions that follows. Sumerian kingship narratives also follow this sequence. Kingship descends, authority is exercised, reforms are implemented. Then the narrative withdraws from the king's actions and moves on to lineage. The king becomes a name in a list. Presence gives way to structure. What is striking is how rarely these phases overlap visibly. Entry does not linger. Adjustment is obscured. Withdrawal is quiet. The texts avoid transitional chaos. They present change as smooth, even when it is born of disruption. This presentation reinforces legitimacy. Change feels inevitable rather than imposed. The timing of these phases is consistent. Entry aligns with moments of instability. Adjustment occurs during periods of narrowed attention. Withdrawal follows restoration of normalcy. This timing ensures minimal resistance. By the time attention returns fully, the process is complete. This is not unique to divine narratives. Human institutions in Sumerian texts operate similarly. Laws are introduced after crisis. Administrative reforms follow famine or flood. Once stability returns, the reforms are no longer debated, they are simply part of the world. The pattern also explains why Sumerian texts are so resistant to reconstruction of process. Modern readers often search for missing steps. The ancient authors did not intend those steps to be recoverable. Their purpose was not documentation of change, but preservation of order. Entry, adjustment, and withdrawal form a complete cycle. Omitting any one would weaken the narrative. Entry without adjustment would imply chaos. Adjustment without withdrawal would imply instability. Withdrawal without entry would imply absence of authority. The texts maintain balance by keeping all three present, though not equally visible. The Anunnaki fit into this cycle as stabilizers rather than initiators. They are not the ones who enter dramatically. They are not the ones who withdraw visibly. They appear at the point where adjustment must be finalized. Their judgments close the process. Once they have acted, withdrawal follows naturally. This explains why they are often associated with silence and finality. They do not debate, they decree. Debate has already occurred elsewhere or earlier. Their presence signals that the time for observation has passed. In practical terms, this pattern reflects an understanding of how systems endure. Constant intervention undermines stability. Permanent presence invites dependency. Withdrawal after adjustment allows autonomy within boundaries. The Sumerians encoded this understanding mythologically. The repetition of this pattern across unrelated texts suggests that it was not a narrative accident. It was a cultural model for how authority should operate. Appear when needed. Adjust quietly. Withdraw once order is restored. Natural events often bracket this cycle. Storms precede entry. Cold and darkness accompany adjustment. Calm follows withdrawal. These conditions are not causes, they are markers. They tell the reader when each phase is occurring without needing explanation. This bracketing allows the text to remain sparse while still conveying sequence. The reader learns to recognize when something has begun, when something is underway, and when something has ended, even if the details are absent. The absence of detail is therefore functional. It trains the audience to focus on outcomes rather than mechanisms. This focus supports continuity. Societies endure not by remembering every step, but by accepting results. Modern readers may find this frustrating. The impulse to reconstruct hidden processes is strong. The Sumerian texts resist it deliberately. They offer structure instead of transparency. This resistance does not imply deception. It implies confidence. The authors assumed that the pattern itself was sufficient. Entry occurs, adjustment follows, withdrawal confirms success. The world moves on. Once this pattern is recognized, it becomes difficult to unsee. It appears in legal texts, hymns, epics, and administrative lists. It governs divine behavior and human governance alike. Change in the Sumerian worldview is not chaotic, it is procedural. The procedure is rarely shown in full. It is inferred through repetition. As the narrative continues forward, this pattern provides a framework for understanding subsequent events. Whenever presence intensifies, adjustment is underway. Whenever silence follows, withdrawal has occurred. The absence of overt description becomes informative rather than puzzling. The tablets do not resolve these cycles, they repeat them. Each repetition reinforces the structure. Authority appears when needed, systems adjust, authority recedes. This rhythm allows the world to change without collapsing. It preserves order without freezing it. It explains how continuity survives disruption. The story does not conclude here. It deepens. With each new event, the same sequence unfolds quietly beneath the surface. Entry, adjustment, withdrawal. The pattern remains intact, carrying the narrative forward, not toward an ending, but toward the next moment when conditions align again and the cycle resumes without announcement. The texts speak about observation during times of crisis, not by describing what is seen, but by emphasizing what is no longer possible to see. Observation, in the Sumerian and wider Mesopotamian record, is treated as a condition that depends on stability. When that stability breaks, observation degrades naturally without requiring suppression or prohibition. The tablets assume this degradation as a given, and they build their narratives around it. In periods of crisis, observation narrows before it fails. Attention contracts toward what is immediately necessary. Peripheral awareness diminishes. The texts reflect this contraction through changes in narrative focus. Details disappear, descriptions shorten, chronology compresses. The reader is moved rapidly through time without the anchoring markers that normally structure events. This is not stylistic inconsistency. It mirrors lived experience. Ancient societies relied heavily on direct observation. There were no abstract monitoring systems to replace human presence. When crisis struck, observation required physical proximity. Floods displaced populations. Cold confined them. Darkness reduced visibility. Travel became dangerous or impossible. In such conditions, observation ceased not because it was forbidden, but because it could not be sustained. The tablets acknowledge this indirectly. They note that temples fall silent, priests are absent, ritual schedules break, administrative records pause. These are not treated as failures, they are treated as consequences. Observation, in this worldview, is a function of order. When order falters, observation follows. What is striking is that the texts never frame this loss of observation as a problem to be solved. There is no urgency to restore visibility during crisis. Restoration comes after stability returns. Until then, the absence of observation is accepted. This acceptance reveals an understanding that certain processes cannot be witnessed without interference. The gods themselves are said to withdraw their gaze during catastrophe. This withdrawal is often misunderstood as fear or regret. A more structural reading suggests something else. Observation implies responsibility. When observation is withdrawn, outcomes are allowed to unfold according to decisions already made. The gaze is unnecessary once fate is fixed. The Anunnaki, as judges, operate at a level beyond observation. Their role is not to watch events unfold, but to determine what those events will mean. Once judgment is rendered, observation becomes redundant. The tablets reinforce this by minimizing descriptions of divine presence during crises. The gods do not hover, they retreat. This retreat parallels human experience. During crisis, people stop watching systems and start enduring them. They do not monitor governance. They do not question authority. They focus on survival. Observation of power ceases at precisely the moment when power is most active. The texts encode this dynamic without commentary. They show that when the world is unstable, observation is unreliable. Testimony fragments, memory distorts, records thin. What survives is impression rather than detail. This is why crisis narratives in the tablets are often followed by lists. King lists resume, lineages continue, laws are enumerated. These lists do not explain how order was restored. They assert that it was. Observation returns only once outcomes are established. The loss of observation also affects accountability. Without witnesses, responsibility diffuses. Decisions cannot be traced easily. Authority remains intact because it is not confronted. The texts present this as normal. Authority is not expected to justify itself during chaos. Justification belongs to stable times. In legal terms, observation requires due process. Crisis suspends due process. Emergency measures replace deliberation. Ancient societies recognize this implicitly. The tablets do not record debates during crisis because debates did not occur meaningfully. Decisions were made elsewhere or earlier. The underworld again provides a parallel. It is a realm without observation. Souls do not witness. They exist within fixed conditions. Judgment there is final because it is unobserved. The surface world briefly resembles this realm during crisis. Observation withdraws. Judgment proceeds. Weather events play a central role in this withdrawal. Storms obscure sight. Cold reduces movement. Darkness erases landmarks. These conditions degrade sensory input. The texts repeatedly associate them with divine silence. Silence does not indicate absence of action. It indicates absence of observation. This absence is protective. Observation invites reaction. Reaction complicates adjustment. By allowing observation to lapse, the system ensures that adjustment occurs without resistance. The tablets do not moralize this. They describe it as structural reality. Later traditions influenced by Mesopotamian thought preserve this logic. Prophetic literature often describes visions during crisis, not widespread observation. A single observer sees what others cannot because ordinary perception has failed. Even then, the vision is symbolic, not documentary. Observation remains limited. The texts also show that observation returns gradually. Light reappears, warmth increases, movement resumes. With it comes curiosity but not investigation. People ask what has changed, not how it changed. The distinction matters. The process remains hidden. The outcome is accepted. This acceptance is reinforced by relief. After crisis, survival itself feels sufficient. Gratitude replaces scrutiny. The impulse to question authority diminishes. The tablets capture this by moving quickly past crisis resolution into normalcy. Observation during crisis is therefore treated as neither possible nor desirable. It is incompatible with the conditions required for systemic change. Ancient authors understood that trying to preserve observation during upheaval would undermine continuity. The texts do not present this as manipulation. They present it as alignment between human limitation and cosmic order. When the world is unstable, perception cannot be trusted. Better to suspend observation than to draw false conclusions. This suspension also preserves mythic coherence. By limiting observation, the texts avoid contradiction. Different witnesses would have different accounts. Silence avoids fragmentation. A single outcome remains authoritative. In modern terms, this resembles degraded situational awareness during emergencies. Information flows, but it is incomplete. Decisions are made with partial data. Later analysis reconstructs events imperfectly. The ancient texts accept this imperfection, rather than attempting to correct it. The Anunnaki's judgments align with this acceptance. They do not require observation to be legitimate. Their authority precedes perception. Whether anyone watches or not is irrelevant to outcome. This is why the texts rarely describe beings moving openly during crisis. Movement would require observation to be meaningful. Without observation, movement dissolves into condition. It leaves no narrative trace. Instead, the texts focus on markers. Before the crisis, after the crisis, during the crisis, silence. The reader learns to recognize this structure and to infer what occurred without being shown. This inference is not meant to be resolved. It is meant to be carried forward. Each crisis reinforces the pattern. Observation collapses. Adjustment occurs, observation returns, the world persists altered. The durability of this pattern suggests that ancient societies accepted limits to knowledge without anxiety. They did not demand transparency from the cosmos. They trusted that order would reassert itself, even if the process remained unseen. Modern discomfort with unobserved change often leads to speculation. Ancient texts preempted this by embedding unobservability into the structure of reality itself. Not everything is meant to be seen. Some things happen when seeing is impossible. The texts do not conclude by explaining this. They move on. Observation resumes where it can. Memory stabilizes. Life continues. As the narrative carries forward, this understanding of observation becomes foundational. Whenever crisis appears, the reader knows that visibility will fail. What follows will matter more than what was seen. The story continues without closing the gap, leaving observation behind as a temporary luxury that returns only once adjustment has already taken hold. When nature becomes a shield rather than a threat, the texts signal a reversal in how disruption functions within the order of the world. Nature does not change its character. Storms remain storms. Cold remains cold. Darkness remains darkness. What changes is their role. Instead of acting as forces to be endured or survived, they become conditions that insulate deeper processes from interference. The danger they pose is real, but their greater function lies in what they obscure. In ancient records, nature is never portrayed as chaotic in itself. It follows cycles, responds to balance, and reflects underlying order. Threat emerges only when nature intersects with human vulnerability. When that vulnerability intensifies, nature's overwhelming presence draws focus so completely that it shields everything else from view. The threat occupies perception. The shield operates quietly beneath it. This transformation is subtle and is never announced directly in the tablets. Instead, it is implied through sequence. A natural event dominates the narrative. Human response fills the foreground. Meanwhile, other developments are compressed, delayed, or omitted entirely. The shield is effective precisely because attention is captured elsewhere. Flood narratives illustrate this most clearly. The flood threatens all life. It demands absolute focus. Survival becomes the only concern. Yet beneath this existential threat, boundaries are erased, hierarchies reset, and conditions for new order are established. The flood shields these processes by overwhelming perception. No one watches governance when the world is underwater. Cold functions in a similar way, though more quietly. Extended cold reduces movement without dramatic spectacle. It confines populations. It slows communication. It limits observation. The threat is persistent but not explosive. This persistence creates long intervals during which attention remains narrowed. Nature becomes a sustained shield, not a momentary distraction. Darkness reinforces this shielding effect. Without light, even familiar spaces become uncertain. Orientation falters. The ability to witness diminishes. Darkness does not destroy structures, but it renders them temporarily invisible. In the tablets, darkness often coincides with divine silence. Silence is not absence, it is insulation. When nature acts as a shield, it absorbs scrutiny. Any anomaly that occurs during disruption is attributed to the disruption itself. Unusual movement becomes emergency response. Missing records become casualties of the event. Delayed communication becomes understandable. Nature provides explanation in advance. The texts rely on this logic without elaboration. They assume that when nature dominates, other processes can proceed unchallenged. This assumption reflects lived experience. During crisis, people do not audit authority. They seek stability. The Anunnaki's association with judgment aligns with this shielding function. Judgment does not require visibility. It requires acceptance. Nature creates conditions where acceptance is easier than resistance. When survival is uncertain, outcomes are received rather than contested. In several texts, gods are described as seeking refuge during catastrophe. This is often misread as fear. A more structural reading suggests withdrawal into domains that are already shielded by nature's dominance. While the surface world struggles, deeper order remains insulated. Nature as shield also explains why many changes appear to arise spontaneously after crisis. To those who endured the threat, the return of calm feels like resolution. Attention relaxes, relief sets in. It is at this moment that new conditions are noticed but not questioned. The shield has done its work. The tablets repeatedly show that once nature's threat recedes, the opportunity for scrutiny has passed. Memory has been shaped by hardship. Gratitude overrides curiosity. The new order feels earned rather than imposed. This dynamic does not require coordination or intent. It requires alignment. Nature's threat naturally occupies attention. Shielding emerges as a consequence. The texts reflect this alignment rather than attributing it to design. Nature also shields through scale. Large-scale events flatten distinction. Individual actions disappear within mass movement. The larger the event, the less visible any single deviation becomes. Ancient authors understood this intuitively. They did not need to articulate it. In periods of calm, nature recedes into background. Human systems dominate. Observation expands. Accountability increases. This is when overt action becomes risky. The texts show that significant adjustments rarely occur during such times. They wait. When nature surges forward, the balance flips. Human systems contract. Observation narrows. Authority consolidates. Nature's threat shields authority not by protecting it, but by distracting from it. The underworld again provides a conceptual parallel. It is shielded permanently by separation. What occurs there is not subject to surface observation. During crises, the surface world temporarily resembles the underworld. Visibility collapses. Outcomes are fixed elsewhere. The tablets never frame this as injustice. They frame it as inevitability. Nature's cycles create moments where perception is overwhelmed. Those moments are used, not wasted. In later traditions, this logic persists. Plagues, famines, and long winters precede reforms and reordering. The natural threat absorbs resistance. The change survives. Modern systems reflect this pattern unconsciously. Emergency powers expand during disasters. Temporary measures become permanent. Oversight relaxes. Once the threat passes, the new arrangement remains. The ancient texts capture this pattern without naming it. They show that nature does not merely threaten life, it structures attention. When attention is structured, outcomes follow. Nature becomes a shield because it does not argue. It does not negotiate. It does not explain. It simply demands response. In doing so, it clears the field. This does not diminish the suffering involved. The texts acknowledge hardship. They do not romanticize it. They simply recognize its function within a larger order. The shielding effect of nature also protects narratives. By compressing detail, it preserves coherence. The story moves forward without contradiction. What happened during the shielded interval remains unexamined. This preservation is essential for continuity. Without it, history would fracture under the weight of unresolved process. The tablets choose endurance over transparency. When nature is a threat, it challenges survival. When nature becomes a shield, it protects outcome. Both roles coexist. The distinction lies in perspective. The tablets guide the reader toward this understanding without instruction. They show storms, cold, and darkness doing more than damage. They show them clearing space. Once the shield lifts, the world feels familiar again. People rebuild, systems resume, attention widens. Only subtle differences remain. These differences are rarely traced back to the moment of shielding. The threat dominates memory. The shield fades unnoticed. The narrative continues forward in this way, not resolving whether nature intended to shield anything at all, but showing repeatedly that when nature overwhelms perception, something else is free to settle into place quietly, enduring long after the danger has passed, carrying the story onward without pause or explanation. The difference between intervention and presence is subtle, but the tablets treat it as foundational. Intervention implies disruption of an existing process. Presence implies alignment within it. Ancient texts consistently favour the latter, not because intervention is impossible, but because it is destabilising. The world they describe is not managed through constant correction, but through sustained orientation. What intervenes calls attention to itself. What is present shapes outcomes quietly. In early cosmology, the gods do not hover continuously over human affairs. They occupy domains. They maintain positions. Their influence radiates outward through structure rather than action. When something changes, it is rarely because a god stepped in at the last moment. It is because a presence had already shaped conditions long before the change became visible. Intervention is episodic. Presence is continuous. The tablets privilege continuity. They describe intervention only when continuity has failed. Floods, plagues, and overt destruction are signs that systems have exceeded tolerable limits. These moments are rare and are framed as last measures rather than preferred methods. The overwhelming majority of divine activity is described as maintenance, not interruption. This distinction matters because it explains why earthbound activity is so rarely described as dramatic. If presence is already embedded in the system, nothing needs to be done visibly. Outcomes unfold naturally within established parameters. The role of authority is not to push events forward, but to ensure that when they move in acceptable directions. The Anunnaki exemplify this logic. They are not depicted intervening constantly. They are depicted presiding. Their authority exists regardless of whether they are actively engaged. When they act, it is not to alter trajectory suddenly, but to confirm what trajectory has become inevitable. Intervention draws resistance. Presence does not. Ancient societies understood this at every level. A ruler who intervened constantly in daily life was seen as unstable or tyrannical. A ruler whose presence was assumed did not need to appear often. The tablets mirror this political reality at a cosmic scale. This is why divine presence is often described spatially rather than temporally. Gods dwell in temples, mountains, or domains. Their presence is fixed. Intervention, by contrast, is described through movement, descent, or sudden speech. These moments are rare and are often followed by consequences that signal imbalance rather than order. The distinction also explains why storms and disruptions accompany moments of intervention, but not presence. When presence governs, the world feels stable. When intervention occurs, the world becomes noisy. The storm announces that continuity has been breached. The intervention repairs or resets, but at cost. In Sumerian texts, presence is often associated with breath, wind, and atmosphere. Not because these are chaotic forces, but because they are constant. Breath is always present. Wind is always moving, even when imperceptible. This makes them ideal metaphors for authority that does not need to announce itself. Intervention, on the other hand, is associated with weight. Floodwaters crush, fire consumes, walls collapse. These are heavy actions. They leave marks. The tablets treat them as exceptional. The Anunnaki's judgments belong to the realm of presence rather than intervention. Judgment fixes outcome. It does not require spectacle. Once judgment is rendered, the world aligns accordingly. There is no need for further action. This alignment is often mistaken for passivity. It is not. Presence is active in a structural sense. It constrains possibility. It shapes what can and cannot occur without ever appearing to act. The texts reinforce this by describing long periods where nothing seems to happen. Kings reign peacefully. Cities prosper. The gods are silent. This silence is not neglect. It is evidence that presence is sufficient. When intervention finally occurs, it is framed as failure of presence rather than its exercise. Humanity grows too numerous. Noise becomes excessive. Balance is lost. Intervention restores the possibility of presence by clearing excess. This framing preserves legitimacy. Intervention is never portrayed as preference. It is portrayed as necessity. Presence is the default state. Intervention is a correction when default conditions are violated. The difference also explains why the tablets resist describing mechanisms. Presence does not have mechanisms. It has effects. Attempting to describe how presence operates would reduce it to intervention, to a series of actions that could be contested or misunderstood. Instead, the texts describe results. Lifespans change. Boundaries shift. Access is restricted. These are outcomes of presence reasserting itself after intervention. The underworld again provides a contrast. There, presence is absolute. Nothing intervenes. The rules are fixed. This makes the underworld stable, but inert. The surface world balances between presence and intervention, between order and change. In narratives where gods descend, the descent itself is intervention. It disrupts domains. It creates imbalance. The return restores presence. The story resolves not when the descent occurs, but when presence is re-established. This structure appears repeatedly. Inanna descends. The world above falters. Her return restores fertility. The intervention is dramatic. The presence afterward is quiet. The tablets emphasize the restoration rather than the drama. The goal is always return to presence. Intervention is tolerated only as a means to that end. This perspective also clarifies why ancient texts rarely attribute ongoing management to visible action. The gods do not micromanage. They establish conditions and withdraw. Their presence remains embedded in law, ritual, and structure. Modern readers often expect agency to look like action. Ancient texts define agency differently. Agency is the capacity to define limits. Once limits exist, behavior follows. The Anunnaki's role as determiners of fate fits this definition precisely. Fate is not a series of actions. It is a constraint. It determines what paths remain open. Once fate is set, presence governs outcome without further effort. This is why fate is often described as heavy or binding. It weighs on the world without moving. It does not need to intervene. It already surrounds. Intervention disrupts time. Presence shapes duration. The tablets are deeply concerned with duration. They track dynasties, reigns, cycles. They care less about moments than about continuity. Intervention produces moments. Presence produces eras. The texts preserve eras. This distinction also governs how humans are portrayed. Heroes intervene. Administrators preside. Heroes are remembered briefly. Administrators endure through lists and institutions. The Anunnaki are administrators at a cosmic scale. Their presence ensures that the world operates within tolerable bounds. When those bounds are exceeded, intervention occurs elsewhere, often through Enlil or through natural events. Once balance is restored, the Anunnaki's presence resumes quietly. This separation of roles prevents concentration of spectacle. No single figure embodies both presence and intervention continuously. This diffusion preserves order. The tablets also suggest that presence can be mistaken for absence. When nothing dramatic occurs, humans assume no one is watching. This assumption is false within the mythic framework. Presence does not require observation to function. This misunderstanding contributes to cycles of overreach. Humans expand, become noisy, test limits. Intervention follows. Presence is reasserted. The cycle repeats. The difference between intervention and presence therefore underpins the entire cosmology. It explains why change is often experienced as sudden, while stability feels natural. It explains why authority feels distant during calm and oppressive during crisis. Nature plays a role in this dynamic by amplifying or dampening perception. During calm conditions, presence fades into background. During storms, intervention dominates attention. The transition between these states shapes experience of authority. When nature acts as a shield, presence operates without scrutiny. When nature becomes a threat, intervention becomes visible. The texts show this oscillation without explaining it explicitly. The Anunnaki are associated with the quiet side of this oscillation. They belong to the phase where intervention has ended and presence must hold. Their judgments finalize change and allow presence to resume. This is why they are rarely depicted interacting directly with humans. Direct interaction would blur the distinction. It would turn presence into intervention. Instead, humans experience presence through structure, through limits, through conditions that feel natural because they persist. The tablets preserve this understanding by avoiding detailed depiction of earthbound action. They do not show presence acting because presence is not action, it is condition. This perspective challenges modern expectations but aligns with ancient administrative reality. Systems endure not because they are constantly adjusted, but because they are rarely disturbed. Intervention is costly, presence is efficient. The tablets favour efficiency. As the narrative continues forward, this distinction becomes increasingly important. Events are not evaluated by how dramatic they are, but by whether they represent intervention or presence. Storms signal intervention. Calm signals presence. The reader learns to recognize when the world is being corrected and when it is being held. The texts do not resolve this tension. They rely on it. The difference between intervention and presence is not a philosophical abstraction in the tablets. It is a practical model for how authority survives across time without exhausting itself. Presence does not need witnesses. Intervention cannot avoid them. This is why presence dominates the narrative, even when unseen. The story moves forward with this understanding embedded. When nothing appears to happen, presence is at work. When everything appears to happen at once, intervention has become unavoidable. Neither state is permanent. They alternate as conditions require. The tablets record this alternation through rhythm rather than explanation. As calm follows disruption, presence settles back into place. The world feels stable again. The mechanisms of change remain unexamined. The narrative does not pause to clarify. It proceeds. Presence holds. Intervention recedes. And the story continues onward, not toward revelation, but toward the next moment when limits are tested again, and the difference between acting and being present becomes visible only through its effects. No records ever describe discovery during the event because discovery requires conditions that crises systematically erase. The tablets do not treat this as an omission or a failure of documentation. They treat it as structural reality. Discovery demands time, stability, excess attention, and the ability to compare observations across moments. During disruptive events, those conditions do not exist. What remains is endurance, not investigation. In the ancient world, discovery was not a spontaneous act. It was cumulative. It depended on repeated observation, comparison with memory, and communal validation. A single witness noticing something unusual did not constitute discovery. It became discovery only when it could be confirmed, contextualized, and preserved. Crisis interrupts every step of that process. The tablets reflect this interruption consistently. During floods, storms, cold periods, and darkness, records stop. Names disappear. Chronology compresses. The narrative does not slow down to describe what people saw. It speeds up. This acceleration is not accidental. It mirrors how perception collapses under pressure. Discovery requires curiosity. Crisis replaces curiosity with urgency. When survival becomes primary, the impulse to investigate secondary phenomena vanishes. The texts assume this without explanation. They do not describe people noticing anomalies because noticing anomalies would imply available attention. Even when something extraordinary occurs, it does not become discovery if it cannot be processed. A movement seen briefly in darkness, an unfamiliar structure glimpsed during evacuation, an unexplained sound during a storm. These experiences remain isolated impressions. Without stability, they do not coalesce into knowledge. Ancient societies were acutely aware of this limitation. Their record-keeping practices reflected it. Scribes wrote when conditions allowed. They documented transactions, rituals, and decrees during periods of calm. During crisis, scribes became labourers, refugees, or casualties. The act of writing itself became impossible or irrelevant. The tablets therefore preserve discovery only after events, never during them. Knowledge emerges once stability returns. By then, the conditions that allowed whatever occurred are gone. Discovery becomes retrospective, speculative, or symbolic rather than empirical. This pattern is especially clear in flood narratives. No text describes people discovering divine mechanisms during the flood. No one observes the gods at work. The flood is total. Observation is meaningless. When the waters recede, the world is different. Discovery consists of recognizing difference, not witnessing its cause. The same applies to cold and darkness. Extended winters and periods of obscured skies reduce sensory input. Vision narrows, hearing dulls, movement slows. Under such conditions, perception becomes unreliable. The tablets do not frame this as ignorance. They frame it as limitation. Discovery also requires language. It must be described, named, and shared. Crisis fragments language. Communication breaks down. Dialects diverge. Signals fail. Without shared language, observation cannot be transformed into record. The absence of discovery during events is therefore not suspicious. It is expected. The tablets encode this expectation repeatedly. They never suggest that something could have been discovered but was not. They assume discovery was impossible by definition. This assumption extends to divine activity. The gods are not discovered during crisis because discovery implies visibility and comprehension. Divine action, when it occurs, is placed outside the frame of observation intentionally, not to hide it, but because it does not belong to the observable layer of reality. The Anunnaki's judgments occur at a level that is not accessible to human perception even under ideal conditions. During crisis, this inaccessibility becomes absolute. There is nothing to discover because discovery would imply proximity to decision-making that humans are never meant to have. The texts reinforce this boundary by presenting divine assemblies as occurring elsewhere, before or after disruption. Humans are never present. They never overhear deliberation. They never interrupt judgment. Discovery is structurally excluded. In later traditions influenced by Mesopotamian thought, this exclusion persists. Prophets receive visions, not observations. They see symbols, not processes. Even privileged insight does not equate to discovery. It conveys meaning, not mechanism. The distinction between meaning and mechanism is crucial. Discovery seeks mechanism. Myth conveys meaning. During crisis, meaning matters more than mechanism. The tablets prioritize meaning consistently. This priority explains why anomalies during crisis are absorbed rather than investigated. If something unusual occurs, it is interpreted within existing frameworks. It becomes an omen, a sign, or a symptom. It is not treated as evidence requiring independent verification. The absence of discovery also protects authority. Discovery during crisis would invite reinterpretation of events while outcomes are still fluid. This would destabilize resolution. By ensuring that discovery occurs only after outcomes are fixed, the system preserves coherence. Ancient authors did not need to articulate this explicitly. Their audiences understood that crisis suspends inquiry. They lived it. The tablets simply reflect that reality. Infrastructure strain compounds this effect. When systems degrade, monitoring fails, records are lost, baselines disappear. Without baseline, discovery becomes impossible. There is nothing to compare against. The texts often mark this loss through phrases indicating confusion or silence, not because nothing is happening, but because nothing can be confirmed. The absence of confirmation prevents discovery from taking shape. This also explains why discovery narratives often appear long after events. Generations later, stories circulate about what might have occurred. These stories are mythic, not documentary. They fill gaps left by crisis, but they do not claim direct observation. The tablets themselves resist such retroactive discovery. They do not speculate openly. They preserve structure rather than conjecture. This restraint distinguishes them from later interpretive traditions. When discovery does appear in the texts, it occurs during calm periods. New technologies are introduced, laws are codified, cities are founded. These moments are possible only when attention is wide and resources are abundant. During crisis, innovation halts. Adjustment occurs, but innovation waits. Discovery waits. The absence of discovery during events also shapes memory. People remember suffering more vividly than detail. Memory consolidates around emotional experience. The tablets capture this by emphasizing conditions rather than specifics. After crisis, relief dominates. Relief reduces the desire to interrogate the past. People accept what remains and move forward. Discovery would reopen trauma. The texts reflect this avoidance implicitly. The Anunnaki's association with finality aligns with this dynamic. Once judgment is rendered, there is nothing to discover. Fate is sealed. Discovery would be irrelevant. This irrelevance is not dismissive. It reflects prioritization. The world must continue. Dwelling on process undermines continuity. The absence of discovery during events also explains why later cultures often reinterpret ancient disruptions symbolically. Without concrete records, meaning fills the void. Myth expands where observation failed. Modern readers often interpret this expansion as evidence of ignorance. A more accurate reading recognizes it as evidence of constraint. The ancient world knew when observation was possible and when it was not. This knowledge shaped how events were recorded. Discovery was never expected during crisis, so its absence required no explanation. In modern contexts, this pattern persists. During disasters, investigations are postponed. Data is incomplete. Explanations are provisional. Only later does analysis occur, often with limited evidence. Even then, certainty is elusive. The tablets capture this reality without attempting to overcome it. They accept limits to knowledge as part of order. Not everything can be known at the moment it happens. The phrase, "no records describe discovery during the event," is therefore not a mystery to be solved. It is a pattern to be recognized. The pattern reflects how human systems behave under pressure. Discovery requires surplus. Crisis eliminates surplus. The equation is simple. Ancient texts assume this equation and build around it. They place meaning before mechanism, outcome before observation. This does not imply that nothing was seen. It implies that what was seen could not be preserved as discovery. It dissolved into experience. The tablets do not attempt to reconstruct those dissolved impressions. They move forward. As the narrative continues, this absence becomes instructive. It teaches the reader where to look for understanding, not in the moment of disruption, but in what remains afterward. Discovery, in the ancient sense, is recognition of outcome rather than observation of process. It occurs when the world stabilizes enough to be compared with memory. The story therefore carries on without ever pausing to describe discovery during events, because discovery belongs to another phase entirely. When the event is over, the new order is already in place. The opportunity for discovery has passed. What remains is interpretation. The tablets leave interpretation to later generations, but they do not supply evidence. They supply structure. This structure teaches that during crisis, Nothing is discovered because discovery is incompatible with survival. Observation collapses, meaning persists. The narrative continues forward with this understanding embedded not as a conclusion, but as a constant condition. Whenever disruption appears, discovery disappears. Whenever stability returns, meaning solidifies. The cycle repeats, and the record moves on without ever breaking its rhythm, to document what could never have been known at the time. What remains after the storm passes and attention fades is rarely dramatic, and that is precisely why it endures. The tablets do not describe a clear line between before and after. There is no announcement that the world has changed. Instead, there is a quiet sense of continuation, accompanied by subtle shifts that are only noticeable when compared across time. Life resumes, routines return, and the storm recedes into memory. Yet something has settled into place that was not there before. Ancient texts consistently emphasize resumption, rather than recovery. Fields are worked again. Cities are reoccupied. Ritual calendars restart. These acts signal stability, not restoration. The world does not revert. It moves forward from a slightly altered position. The storm is treated as an interruption, but its consequences are treated as baseline. What remains first is relief. Relief narrows curiosity. Once survival is assured, the impulse to question diminishes. People accept what is present because it is present. The tablets capture this by moving quickly past catastrophe into lists, decrees, and lineages. These are not reflections, they are assertions of continuity. Physical damage is repaired where possible, but not everything is restored to its previous state. Some structures remain abandoned. Some routes are no longer used. Some boundaries shift quietly. The texts do not catalogue losses exhaustively. They record what continues. Absence becomes normal through omission. Administrative changes are often embedded in this phase. New obligations appear. Old exemptions vanish. Responsibilities are redistributed. These changes are framed as responses to necessity, rather than as consequences of the storm itself. The storm explains disruption, not reorganization. Reorganization is treated as pragmatic. The Anunnaki's judgments, when inferred, align with this moment. Fate is no longer being debated. It has been integrated. What remains is not the act of judgment, but its effect. Lifespans are shorter. Access is restricted. Authority feels more distant. These conditions persist without explanation. Memory plays a central role in shaping what remains. Human memory favours experience over structure. People remember cold, hunger, fear, and loss. They do not remember administrative adjustments. The tablets reflect this by preserving outcomes rather than experiences. Emotional memory fades. Structural memory persists. Silence after the storm is therefore meaningful. It is not emptiness. It is the sound of a new equilibrium settling. The absence of commentary signals acceptance. The world has found its footing again. Nature's return to calm reinforces this acceptance. When skies clear and temperatures normalize, the environment signals that danger has passed. This signal encourages psychological closure. Attention widens again, but it widens into a landscape that has already been altered. The texts show that this widening does not produce investigation. It produces normalization. People adapt to what is present rather than interrogating how it came to be. The opportunity for scrutiny existed briefly during the return to calm, but it is overwhelmed by the desire for stability. Infrastructure repairs contribute to this normalization. Temporary fixes become permanent solutions. Emergency pathways become standard routes. Adjustments made under strain are retained because they work. Over time, their origins are forgotten. The tablets often mark this phase with renewed enumeration. Kings reign. Cities stand. Offerings resume. The world is legible again. This legibility reassures. It suggests that order has returned, even if the order is slightly different. What remains is also shaped by what does not return. Certain practices disappear quietly. Certain locations lose significance. Certain names fall out of use. The texts rarely mourn these losses. They are treated as part of transition. In some narratives, the aftermath introduces new limits. Humans are no longer allowed certain access. Knowledge is restricted. Boundaries harden. These limits are not justified explicitly. They are presented as facts. The storm's role in enabling them is implied, not stated. The Anunnaki's withdrawal is complete by this point. Presence recedes. Authority becomes abstract again. Humans experience the result as reality rather than intervention. There's nothing to argue with. Over time, the storm itself becomes a reference rather than a memory. It is mentioned briefly, if at all. Its name fades. What remains is its function as a marker. Before this, things were different. After this, things are as they are. The tablets preserve this pattern faithfully. They do not dwell on aftermath. They move on. The lack of emphasis is intentional. What matters is durability, not explanation. What remains is therefore not evidence of what occurred, but proof that something settled. The world holds together. Continuity is preserved. That is the success condition. Modern parallels follow the same logic. After disruption, policies persist. Behaviours shift. Assumptions change. The event that enabled them recedes from attention. The new baseline feels natural. Ancient texts do not moralize this. They do not praise or condemn. They observe. Change that survives does so because it integrates quietly. The storm passes. Attention fades. What remains is not the memory of crisis, but the shape of the world that followed it. The tablets end such episodes without closure because closure would invite retrospection. Instead, they allow the narrative to continue from the new state, as if it had always been that way. This continuity is powerful. It ensures that the adjustment is not revisited. It becomes part of the world's fabric. What remains, then, is not mystery, but structure. Not answers, but conditions. Not evidence, but consequence. The reader is not asked to dwell on what might have occurred. The reader is guided forward into what persists, and so the story continues, not by resolving the question of what happened during the storm, but by showing what endures once it is gone, carrying the weight of quiet change forward as the world resumes its rhythm and attention drifts elsewhere, leaving behind only the settled shape of what now is. As the day settles and the world grows quieter, there is a tendency to imagine that what matters most announces itself clearly, that if something truly significant were to happen, it would demand attention, leave unmistakable traces and insist on being remembered. Yet the record left behind by both ancient texts and lived experience suggests something different. The most enduring changes rarely arrive with noise. They arrive while attention is elsewhere, and they remain because nothing interrupts them afterward. When the storm has passed, what lingers is not urgency, but familiarity. The cold recedes, the lights return, roads reopen, systems stabilize. In that return to normality, the mind relaxes. The question shifts from what happened to how quickly life can resume. Memory shortens, curiosity softens. The moment for questioning closes almost as soon as it opens. The tablets never instruct the reader to be suspicious. They do not warn of hidden hands or concealed movements. Instead, they demonstrate a pattern so often that it becomes quietly intuitive. Disruption absorbs attention. Adjustment occurs. Calm returns. Whatever changed during the interval settles into place without resistance. The lack of resistance is not forced. It is earned through relief. If something did move while attention was narrowed, it would not need to hide afterward. Its success would be measured not by secrecy, but by permanence. The absence of evidence would not indicate absence of action. It would indicate completion. What is finished does not announce itself. It simply remains. Ancient authors seemed comfortable with this idea. They did not chase certainty. They did not attempt to reconstruct what could not be observed. They accepted that some processes occur beyond the reach of direct perception, not because they are forbidden, but because perception itself has limits. In their view, the world was not a place where everything meaningful could be witnessed, only where outcomes could be lived within. Modern life often creates the illusion that observation is constant. Screens glow, data streams flow, alerts arrive endlessly. Yet even now, attention can be redirected in an instant. A storm, a crisis, a disruption, and focus collapses to the immediate. The rest fades into background noise. When attention returns, it returns to a world already adjusted. If something had shifted during that absence, would it feel foreign, or would it feel inevitable? Would it stand out as intrusion, or blend into routine so completely that it felt as though it had always been there? The tablets suggest the latter. Change that endures is change that feels natural once it has settled. There is no instruction here to believe that anything moved at all, only an invitation to notice how often the world changes without asking permission, and how rarely those changes announce their arrival. The storm does not need to explain itself. The calm does not explain what preceded it. Life continues between those states, accepting what remains. As attention drifts and thoughts slow, the question does not need an answer. It does not need to be resolved. It only needs to be held gently, the way ancient stories were held, not as puzzles to solve, but as patterns to recognize. If something did move while we looked away, its trace would not be found in the noise of the storm, but in the quiet certainty of what followed. In the way the world feels settled again, in the way nothing seems out of place, even if it was not always so. And with that thought resting where effort no longer follows it, the story does what it has always done. It does not end. It simply becomes part of the background, steady and unremarkable, as attention fades and sleep approaches, carrying forward whatever has already taken its place without asking to be seen.